Good morning everyone สวัสดีนะคะสวัสดีผู้เข้าร่วมประชุมทุกท่านนะคะที่ยังอยู่กันจนถึงวันสุดท้ายเนาะ Today is the last day for the IAEA expert mission. I'm so sad that this is like the last day that we can have a hang out with you with the knowledge. I'm so sad. But that's okay. So today we are going to talk about the CT optimization by Dr. Samuel Bradley, and then we're gonna finish up this mission with Dr. Kalpana Kanal about the future of the DIR. So welcome, Dr. Bradley. Hope you enjoyed Bangkok last night.
Of course, I've enjoyed it thoroughly.
Okay.
It's rained on us every day.
Yeah, so you can see how we suffer from like the traffic and raining, right? You understand more. Okay.
You're so kind to share both things.
Yeah, for sure. You need to like experience the Thai, like a Thai people. Yeah. Okay, welcome. I will give the stage to you.
Thank you. All right. Well, good morning, everyone, especially everyone online. So we've been talking dose reference levels. We've been talking image optimization. And so now we're going to kind of finish up today, circling back to radiation dose. And we're going to go through some techniques and some suggestions and ideas on how to optimize the CT scanner for radiation dose. So when we get to, before we start, I think it'd be kind of fun to do a quick review of where we have been and where we started from in the beginning with CT and how much it has changed over the last 4 or 5 decades since it was developed. So the very first CT scanner was developed in the first clinical CT scanner was developed and put into service in 1971. The very first CT scan, clinical CT scan that was performed was done on October 1st. So we're in that same month. It was done in England. So Dr. Hounsfield was a scientist over in England. Here you can see a picture of the very first clinical scan. This young lady, as you can see, the system was only big enough to insert only the cranium, just the top part of the head. So we couldn't even do the face. We definitely couldn't do the body. And then you can see a scan somewhat around that time frame, about 1975. So it wasn't the actual picture of this patient. But you can see that was the quality of image that we, or our radiologists, had to look at in the beginning with CT. So we've come a long ways. The first CT scanner was about $350,000 installed in 1970. So that's a lot of money for then. The system would acquire the images, and it would take quite a while to do it. And all of the data, all of the information that came off of the CT scanner would be saved on one of these 5.5-inch floppy drives. So I don't know how many of you have ever even seen or held one of these. I remember these back when I was young. They don't hold a lot of information, just kilobytes worth of information. And that's compared to our gigabytes worth of information we deal with now in modern CT. The first body CT scanner was developed about 5 or 6 years after the head CT scanner. So the second clinical CT scanner installed was installed in the US of A at the Mayo Clinic. And here is just a picture of the scanner that's displayed there at the Mayo Clinic. And here is an example of the picture of that first CT scanner that was used in Wimbledon, England. So the evolution of the CT scanner from the early days, actually that should say 1975, my apologies, 1970s, early 2000s, and now we're getting closer to I should update this and get a 2022 in there. You can just see how the image quality, the matrix size, everything has come a long ways with the technology. So here's the first body scanner that was developed, and it made possible obviously to image the body. And you can see here, just look at the lack of detail in either of these images. It took 4 minutes for a single rotation around the body. So 4 minutes per slice. So as you can see, there's no IV contrast because there's just no way to capture the IV contrast. So we've come a long ways. And the whole reason I wanted to kind of show you this was, it's my personal opinion that the greatest dose reduction that we can provide for our patients actually comes from updating the technology. We have come a long way since the 70s, and now we're in an era where CT scanner technology usually changes about every 5 years. Something new comes along that makes it so that we get better image quality at lower doses. So we've already talked a little bit about a couple of things yesterday when it came to image quality. We mostly focused on two different types of CT reconstruction, iterative reconstruction and deep learning reconstruction, and how both of those have enabled really good image quality. So we've reduced the noise quite substantially in the images. Today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how deep learning reconstruction can also help with dose optimization. And then the second thing I want to talk about in my next talk is I'm going to talk a little bit about spectral CT. So I asked this question at the very top of this slide is what are the next two big technologies on the horizon? AI and probably moving more towards photon counting besides just dual energy, but spectral CT in general. Those are kind of the future, the future decade, the upcoming decade is probably going to bring these two future technologies more into focus for us. So you've seen this slide, of course. We've been talking quite a bit about DRLs. DRLs for CT are most specifically CTDI volume and dose length product. And if you can, I highly recommend SSDE also. Now, the reason I point this out is because the very first thing we really should be determining is to make sure that the volume CTDI that we display on our CT scanner is actually accurate. So what you need to do is you need your physicists to go in and use their CTDI phantoms, the ion chambers, and they need to do they need to do calculations and make sure the CTDI value on the CT scanner is accurate, because those are the values, of course, that are going to be sent up to the OAP and then, of course, eventually used for comparisons to national DRLs. Of course, we've talked quite a bit about the team. Dr. Canal really talked quite a bit extensively about the importance of each person on the team, radiologist, technologist, medical physicist. And of course, when it comes to dose reference levels and submitting data and dealing with the technology, then IT folks are very important also. So this is the team that we're going to really focus on today when we talk about dose optimization. So when you're considering dose, you need to kind of take a step back. Dose is actually a very small part of the whole thing, the whole map that we need to optimize when we use CT. So when you consider the idea of utility, why we use CT, when should we use CT, and how should we use CT, there's a bunch of things that we need to kind of figure out. Obviously, appropriateness is one of them. We've talked about image quality, but dose is more on a tertiary level. We need to worry about image quality, appropriateness, when to use it, and then the next thing we need to deal with after that is radiation dose. So what features do we need to optimize when we are talking about radiation dose? Here I've kind of just highlighted some, all things that we're going to talk about today, but scan modes, tube voltages, currents, AEC, so tube current modulation, etc. And so what we need to do is also remember that some of the, not some, but all of the dose features will also directly link to other features related for image quality, such as spatial resolution, image noise, etc. So here we got image quality over here and all of its subcomponents that we talked about yesterday. And you can see how radiation dose affects these objects or these items, and these are directly affected or connected to also the image quality. But you all know that because you've been working in this field for so long. So you know that when you reduce dose, noise goes up. You know that you also lose spatial resolution, etc. So we're going to kind of talk a little bit about that. So when we oftentimes talk about dose, we talk about risk, or we're generally trying to optimize for risk. And so it's, I think, important for us to use that terminology. We optimize for dose, but really what we're trying to do is optimize for risk. And the goal is to maximize the benefit to risk ratio. And so when you look at risk, you can see, of course, that there's a variety of different factors that are also associated with risk, patient age, gender, medical history, etc. So I already just kind of talked about these, but what are the things that are directly linked to patient dose? Well, we know it's the demographics, so I just mentioned some of these things, but these demographics, their height, their weight, their BMI, their age, their gender, all of that will play into the effects of output, radiation output on the CT scanner. And then, of course, I mentioned all the various different modes, such as KVMA, tube current modulation, detector coverage. That all will affect how we optimize radiation dose. So if I were to sit down and tell you the top 3 things to do to optimize to give our patients or your patients the best radiation dose benefit to risk ratio, I would start with talking about appropriateness criteria. And that is because there is no better way to reduce dose to a patient than to only scan them when they need it. Because at that point, you already know the benefit is much greater than the risk because they're receiving a scan that they need. And for us to eliminate scans that they don't need is the best way, because 0 dose is the lowest you can get. So in the US, we have quite a few different ways to think about and look at appropriateness criteria. The American College of Radiology, ACR, has published extensive documents in this area. And I know, of course, you guys have this here in Thailand. You have your indication-based protocoling. And so appropriateness criteria, you need to make sure you've established it. You need to have it for pediatrics. One example of that, in the US, we have what's called PCARN, the Pediatric Emergency Care Applied Research Network. And they've basically developed this algorithm to determine when should we give a CT of the head, or I should more specifically CT of the brain, when there is, say, traumatic brain injury, or maybe the baby or a kid hits their head. And so they've gone through and they've developed this algorithm, and depending on the score that you give them, not always do we need to give a CT. In fact, for a good part of the PCARN algorithm, a lot of it is just observation and then wait. And so obviously that helps us to optimize the dose for our pediatric patients. Here's an example of the ACR appropriateness criteria. It gives us 2 options. It gives us 2 things to look at. The first is it's based on indication, which I imagine you guys have something similar to that here in Thailand. And so depending on if the patient shows up, they have left lower quadrant pain, suspected complication of diverticulitis. And what it does then is it gives you this kind of differential. What should we do? So CT of the abdomen and pelvis with IV contrast is usually appropriate. And then there are these other options here, some of which are CT, some are fluoroscopy. And then it will give a kind of an indication of what is usually not appropriate. And in this case, CT abdomen and pelvis without and with IV contrast. So dual phase CT is not necessary when you're trying to rule out this indication. And so it's great, kind of gives you a simple, quick green, yellow, red, just like your traffic light, of what is appropriate, what isn't, which modalities would be appropriate. Some of them start with ultrasound or MR, and CT is not even on the list. And the second thing it will provide is a kind of rough estimate of how much radiation dose this particular procedure would cost for the patient. So I sat on this committee for quite a few years, and it was interesting because it took a lot of effort to figure out what we would call low, medium, or high dose. And so you see here, there's just symbols. So in this case, a CT abdomen pelvis with IV contrast was given 3 symbols. So if you come over here for an adult, 3 symbols means that this scan would be somewhere between 1 to 10 millisieverts for that patient, for the adult population. If it was a pediatric patient, then it would be somewhere in the 0.3 to 3 millisievert range. So it's not giving specific dose, obviously, to a patient. It's not giving a specific value in any way. It's just a range. And the way we develop these dose categories is we would look in the literature. We, of course, looked at all of it was a large committee of a bunch of people. So we'd look at our dose monitoring softwares, and we just kind of looked at what was the range of doses typical of this kind of CT examination. So appropriateness criteria is great. It helps us to kind of select when and what procedure is best to use going forward. Once you then have once you have the idea that you do need a CT scan, the second thing you can optimize under appropriateness is the level and radiation which you need. Not every CT scan needs to be high quality or low noise. There are some types of scans that, for example, here you have this endo leak right here. You can see it on both of these scans. One was 14 milligray, the other one was just shy of 3 milligray. So depending on the indication, we don't always need the best quality of radiation dose. And so we can set up very specific protocols to take into account of that. So here we got a kind of a shunt, so we have a high contrast image that, and the indication or the clinical diagnostic task here is not difficult to see at low radiation doses. And so for these pediatric patients, you can largely image at a half the dose of a typical or a normal brain CT. All right, so then what would be the second, probably most important tool to optimize to enhance dose reduction or dose optimization in the clinic? And that would be the tube current modulation. One of probably the best technologies developed back in the 90s. It gives the scanner the ability to pick how much radiation it uses as it spins around the patient. And so as we go through the anterior posterior of certain angles, of certain positions at the body, so say here in the shoulders, it might not need as much radiation, but then as it goes through laterally through the shoulders, it's definitely going to need more radiation. And then as it goes down through the z-axis through the body, in the lungs might not need as much radiation because it's mostly air, but once you get to the pelvis, there's a lot of bones, so the radiation dose might come up. The goal here for tube current modulation is basically to keep the image noise fairly consistent, slice to slice through the body. And this helps our radiologists, of course, so that they have uniform or consistent image quality throughout the patient as they were scanned. But it's best for the patient because it only uses the amount of radiation it needs at every moment. For every projection it passes through the body, it knows it's the patient's thickness because we've done a scout image, as you can kind of see up here. The machine's already calculated how much radiation it would need, and so it only uses what it needs in that moment. So there's a few things you need to optimize when it comes to using tube current modulation. Of course, you can use tube current modulation in axial imaging, but it's mostly effective when we do helical, because obviously it spins around the patient in the XY axis and along the Z axis of the patient, or the long body axis. So you all know what pitch is, so I'm not going to belabor this point. But the concept of pitch, of course, takes into account how fast the table is moving through the scanner, and it takes into account the overall beam collimation, the number of detectors over the total range or total collimation. So if the system, the table is moving slower than the X-ray tube is spinning, then you're going to obviously have a pitch of less than 1. And then if you have a pitch of greater than 1, the table is obviously going faster than the tube is spinning. And so there are parts of the body that will physically not be exposed to radiation. And so that means the pitch is greater than 1. Sorry, I failed to point out, if pitch is less than 1, then there's going to be a subtle overlap. As the body's going through, the X-ray tube might actually spin over that certain part of the body more than once. And then if the pitch is equal to 1, table's moving just the right speed as the tube is spinning such that there is no overlap. You have contiguous exposure across the entire z-axis of the body. So does pitch affect patient dose? The answer is no. So let's talk about that. It does not, as long as you're using tube current modulation. Because tube current modulation requires us to tell the system how much noise we want in the image. So for our Canons, we'll type in SD values, GE, noise index, Siemens, quality reference mass. Every vendor has their version or flavor of technical parameter that we type in, our technologists in conjunction with medical physicists. They set up that value, and then that is what dictates how much noise will be in the image, well, roughly. And that also will determine how much output, MA, the system will use as it spins around the body. So let's go through these two scenarios, this idea of pitch of less than 1 and pitch greater than 1. How is the dose affected when we use tube current modulation and pitch? So if we have a pitch of less than 1, we know that the body is being oversampled because for every location along the body, the scanner is actually spinning over it more than once. And so we know if it's going to expose, say, anteriorly more than once, we don't need as much radiation over that range. So as pitch is less than 1, the tube current modulation is reduced. As pitch is greater than 1, because there are physically places on the body that's not sampled, we're undersampling the body, we have to increase the MA so that we can account for that during the reconstruction. So ultimately, when you take into account the fact if it's going slower and lower MA or faster and higher MA, the noise is constant at every slice, and so is the dose. And so they take into account each other. They balance each other out. So using tube current modulation with pitch does not affect dose, as long as you set your noise parameters right. If you have a fixed MA, of course, if you go to a lower pitch, dose is going to go up to the patient. And if you have a greater than 1 pitch, then dose will go down. That's only if you use a fixed MA. And of course, dose and pitch used to be linked for helical imaging back in the day when we only had single slice scanners, which we just don't have anymore. So the whole notion of pitch of less than 1 reduce the dose to patients, that came from the early 2000s when we had slices of 1 CT scanners, single slice CT scanners. So if tube current modulation is the second most important thing to reduce our patient dose, we need to make sure we optimize the use of tube current modulation. So how do we do that? The first thing we do is how we set our patient up. If we put the patient dead center in the isocenter, so the patient's nice and is centered up and down, and the patient is centered left and right on the table, then your images are going to come out proper, because as the system spins around, the patient will always be properly centered, and your selection of bow tie filter will properly contour the dose to the patient. And so that's the whole point here, is if you don't put the patient in the right position, if they're too high or too low, as it spins around, that bow tie filter is going to affect the amount of photons or x-rays getting to the detector, and that's going to cause some image quality issues. So here you can see a patient's too high on the gantry and then too low on the gantry, and you see these phantoms that Dr. Stikotovich, imaged and published. You can see that if the patient's too low, you actually start getting a lot more artifacting posteriorly through the body. Whereas if you're centered, everything looks good. And then once again, if you're going up here, too high up, you might have some noise artifacts and things just don't look good. So key to dose optimization with tube current modulation is center the patient laterally and then up and down in the gantry. Most CT scanners have new technology such that it will measure the center of the patient. And you might not be able to see it, but there's a blue line and a green line. And so it's telling you where the patient center is versus the machine isocenter. And so you can see it's just a teeny little bit off. Some vendors will allow you just to push a button in the CT console. It'll just move the table up and you're good and centered. Others, you have to actually walk in the room and physically move the table up. But either way, it gives you a chance to look at the patient and know that they're centered. For that reason, personally, at our center, we always do a lateral scout or scanogram, topogram, whichever scanner you're using. We always do it first so we can make sure our patient's nice and centered, and then we proceed to do the anterior, the AP or PA scout when we use 2 scouts. So AI, of course, is a big thing, and it's new, but we are seeing it not only affect us image reconstruction, but we're also seeing it in other aspects of CT. So most of the vendors now have provided some kind of light-based camera. So the camera will either be above the patient, mounted to the ceiling. Some cameras are actually mounted inside the gantry, looking out to the patient. And the whole point here is using AI, they can determine the position of the patient, they can determine landmarks, and they can give warnings if the patient's not centered properly positioned, maybe they're skewed, maybe there's an arm in the way, something to that effect. So AI is coming a long ways to help us so that we can properly position our patients and get them in a good place so that when we start the scan, we know that we've optimized as best we can the tube current modulation. So tube current modulation is a great way to help kind of take into account various different sizes. So this question came up yesterday while we were over in the hospital. The question was, should we use weight or size when we calculate different automatic profile or automatic protocol estimations? So GE and Siemens, which we were looking at those two scanners across the street, they both basically do this. They both take into account the patient size. Usually when you look at the scout or the topogram, it gives them a chance, gives the machine, a chance to do some quick measurements and know about how big they are laterally and how thick they are AP or PA. And that is helpful because, as you can see on this plot, size and age are very poor correlators. You can see here in this publication by Kleinman about a decade ago, 2010, so 12 years ago, they looked and sampled. They went through and measured on the CT scan of a bunch of patients, their anterior, posterior, lateral measurements, and then they plotted them as a function of age. And you can see the minimum, the smallest 17-year-old, had the same body habitus dimensions as basically the largest 3-year-old, 2.5-year-old. That's crazy to think. And so that's why it's kind of hard, especially in the body, to set up protocols based on age. So tube current modulation does account for the patient size, but it's also a really good thing when you're setting up protocols, especially when you're using your auto KV selectors for GE, Siemens, or any of the other vendors that do use this. Make sure you set up protocols based on size, and so that you know which KV to use as a function of which body habitus size. And that's just because weight is okay. Don't get me wrong. If that's all you got is weight, that's a great option, but don't use age, especially in the body. Where we can use age is in the head. And we've talked about this a little bit, so I won't belabor the point. We were actually looking at some of the data over on the Radiometrics. They were showing us some head stuff. And so I thought I went and I was able to generate a plot from some of our data. So you can see head data, when you look at age as a function of size, either transverse or anterior posterior dimension, they both, and I'm only showing you the transverse. Well, no, I'm showing you the diameter in this case, but either transverse or AP individually have the same logarithmic response. So little kids up to about 3 to 4 years old, their heads grow pretty rapidly. And then after that, things kind of taper off to about their 5 or 6. And after that, our heads are largely the same size from a 6-7-year-old on the way up to our adult. And so when it comes to setting up protocols, which we've talked about, you only need maybe a couple protocols, especially for pediatrics. But setting up your protocols based on age is actually appropriate because it follows this very well-known curve. And when you actually look at the density, so if you measured the Hounsfield units of the skull, and you do that as a function of age, I didn't sample more than I think 30 or 40 patients because I didn't have a lot of time. But you can see that it still kind of largely follows that logarithmic relationship. So the head grows bigger logarithmically, and the skull gets denser logarithmically. So that means a couple of different things. That means we generally have to use higher KV, so neonates, infants, and that's for a couple of reasons. One, because the skulls are less dense, it's easier to penetrate, so we can do that reasonably without increasing the dose too much. Excuse me. And two, infant brains are largely water-based, so they haven't matured as much, and so you don't have as much inherent contrast in the brain tissue. It's good to image a little lower KV because you get a little bit more of a separation in the gray-white matter, and get a little more separation and contrast in areas that are very subtle, especially in little babies. All right, so kind of sticking quickly with that theme of the head. Fast imaging is always a great way to freeze motion. So helical imaging is fast. Most vendors have fast table movement. There's one vendor out there that has what's called a flash mode that can really go fast. Pitches of 3, and they can go as fast as about 720 or 50, something like that, millimeters per second. And if you've never seen that, it's pretty darn amazing. It kind of looks like a patient will fly off the table because it goes through quick. But most other vendors can go upwards about 400 to 430 millimeters per second. So that means for a chest, abdomen, pelvis, for me, someone that's relatively tall, you could scan my chest down and pelvis in under a second. So that's great. Imaging fast helps reduce. Obviously, it helps reduce bulk motion if the patient's not compliant or moving. They're in pain, so it's hard for them to sit still. Or you have just involuntary motion. You have cardiac and of course breathing at some level. So you want to try to go as fast as possible. And that does play into things with tube current modulation and pitch. But the other thing is you can never go faster than just a single rotation. Most of our scanners can go 0.275 or even 0.35, 0.275, 0.225 I've seen. So our scanners now can really spin quick. And several of them on the market have wide detectors, outwards of 16 centimeters coverage. And so I did this I surveyed a bunch of our patients, and I went through as a function of age, and I went in and I measured the distance that it would take from the top of the apex of their head down through like the SOM line. And I was curious to see if I could, how many of our patient population I could measure in a single rotation using a 16 centimeter coverage. And for our population, and I'm talking young adults outwards up to 35 or so, generally speaking, every one of them would fit in that 16 centimeter collimation. And so you could just put them, position them, get your single axial or volume image located properly, spin it once, and you've got the brain in one shot. So these larger coverage detectors are really good for single spins. We also use them for our infants. For the chest, we can do infant chest and infant abdomen in a single spin. Everything else generally gets a little bit too long for the 16 centimeters. And if you ever try to do a 16 centimeter coverage and then another one, that's actually a lot slower because you spin it quickly, but then you have to move the table and then spin it again. And that table movement is usually about 1 second to 2 seconds. So you can never go faster than a single spin without table motion. And after that, if you have to do multiple coverages, it's best to just go back to helical. In the brain, when we do image over the brain, oftentimes we want to avoid the eye lens. So of course, historically, we would then angle the gantry either way, or for the patients that could, they would be mechanically manipulated to angle their heads if we had to. But there are cases or occasions where you can't do that. Some vendors have systems out there where the gantry will not angle, just won't physically move anymore. And obviously, if a patient comes in a trauma and we can't actually physically manipulate their head, we need to have other options. So there's tube current modulation, which modulates the radiation dose as it spins around the body. And then there's another term of modulation called organ dose modulation. And in this case, what it's doing is it's actually going to turn down the MA, so it's going to modulate the output, but it's only going to do it for a specific range of an anterior sector. So if it's imaging over, for example, the head, over the eyes, or maybe over the thyroid, it's going to turn down the MA over a certain sweep. If it's over the body, for example, if we're trying to spare breast dose, it'll actually reduce MA over a broader sweep. These were the 3 techniques that it was envisioned to use organ dose modulation for eye lens, thyroid, and breast tissue dose reduction. Here you can see some film. I used some radiochromic film, and I sandwiched it between 2 CTDI phantoms just so I can get good scatter. And you can see here when I spun it all the way around, this yellow, it's hard to see, but basically it's just dose. The yellow is pretty uniform. You can see there's attenuation towards the center, which as you go from red, yellow to blue, it's getting less dose here, all of which we understand. But now what happened is we turned on organ dose modulation for a particular vendor, and you can see the MA reduced over that anterior sweep. We did it for the face, and so it was a shorter angle. This particular vendor actually increases the output on the back side of it, so the total integrated dose doesn't change. The anterior dose goes down, but the posterior dose goes up. That's for one vendor. The other vendors that use organ dose modulation, all the other ones, they don't turn it up. They reduce it anteriorly and they keep it normal for the backside. So it wouldn't be as red, it would be back to just yellow. So you could imagine it just being kind of blue up here. So you have to understand, if you're going to use organ dose modulation, you need to understand your vendor specific implementation and how they use it. So there's a couple of ways that we use it. First of all, we use it on all of our patients. I'll show you on my next slide that it does not, we have never found it to impact image quality. So we can use it, of course, to do, eyes and thyroid and all that. But if you turn it on, you're reducing the dose anteriorly, period. So even if you're scanning down past breast tissue down into the abdomen, you're just reducing the overall anterior dose to those organs, as you can kind of see here. We do it. Our particular vendor does not increase the dose on the posterior sweep, and so therefore it reduces anterior sweep. So we actually use it in the case where we know a priori that our patient is pregnant. And so for the most part, it's a great way to kind of reduce fetal dose. My caution to you on that, if you are trying to use this for fetal dose reduction, I wouldn't use it for the vendor that increases the dose on the backside. Because as you can see here, I just put these lines here. So it's just a general location, but the MA doesn't fully reduce over the entire fetus. And you would hate to reduce the fetal dose only to half the body and then increase it to the other half. So that's the only reason I say we use it, because our two main vendors at our hospital do not increase the MA on the backward sweep. So we feel that it's safe. So once again, we did some imaging. Actually, this is a cadaver. So we were completely copacetic with our IRB, or our ethics committee. And so we imaged this head, and we did it with just normal tube current modulation, and we did it with tube current modulation with organ dose modulation. Now, I don't expect you to be able to read this or care, but basically I was just looking at noise, and noise content did not increase anywhere anteriorly in the body where the MA was theoretically reduced, and we didn't see any new artifacting or anything. So, and we've seen that in the body. We use organ dose modulation on everything. Oh, here's that slide I was talking about. So once again, there is one vendor out there that will reduce it on one angle and increase it on the other. And so you just have to be careful you're not increasing the dose to the fetus. All right, so first best option is appropriateness criteria. Only image a patient when they need to be imaged. Second, tube current modulation, organ dose modulation, properly setting up the patient using the right pitch and the noise indices and all that go into that, which we'll talk about in a minute. All of that is great when it comes, those are the kind of top two. What would be probably the third best dose optimization tool? My personal opinion, that is KV. So why is that? Well, we know that if we go from 120, 180, as we reduce KV, dose will go down. We also know that dose will go down if we reduce MA, 300, 200, 100. But when we reduce MA, it reduces linearly. But when we reduce KV, KV will reduce quadratically. So what do I mean by that? Mathematically, that means if I'm going to go from 120 kV down to 80 kV, because it's quadratic, I'm squaring it. I take the ratio of that and square it. I'll get a 56% reduction. If I were to do something somewhat similar, say I reduce my MA by 120 to 80, because it's not quadratic, there's no square here, I would only get an actual 33% dose reduction. So you just have to remember, changing MA affects dose and noise. Changing KV also affects dose and noise. And though I haven't really talked about it yet, or I'm not really going to focus on this, it will also affect image contrast. The lower the KV, the better contrast you get. So here's just a quick example of what has happened in our clinic over the last couple of years. Historically, you can see, so this is data I took from Radiometrics, and I brought it into Excel just because I love to take things into Excel. And there's probably 3 or 4 different scanners in here. This is just a random abdomen pelvis protocol, and it's plotted as a function of body thickness, so effective diameter. Here you can see it follows just a very typical exponential curve. It's ranging from our little kids down here, roughly about 1 to 2 CTDI, a volume of CTDI of 1 to 2 milligray, and up towards our adults, or our adult-like patients, our teenagers and young adults. We're in the 10 milligray range for the body. What we did is we've installed recently a new CT scanner that has a very powerful tube. It allows the MA to go up as high as 1300 MA. And because of that, we were able to start using 80 kV a lot more frequently. In fact, we're able to use 80 kV for almost all of our patient population, except for some of the little bit thicker, larger patients, in which case we need to use 100 kV. To date, we don't even use 120 kV for the body anymore. And you can see just dose reduction. So following this dashed exponential curve versus this solid red curve, that's the dramatic difference of imaging more of your population at a lower kV. All right, so because we use a lower kV, we have to understand the physics of what's going on. The X-rays have less energy at lower kVs. Therefore, they're going to get absorbed a little bit more frequently in the body. So we need to give the body a little bit more X-rays, more photons, to balance out the right amount of dose or photons onto the detector. So I did a quick kind of, I can't even think of the word. It must be Friday. I don't remember how to speak. I went through an exercise. That's the word I'm looking for. I went through a little exercise here with this phantom, because you would think, if I reduce my kV and increase my MA, what's the point? I'm not going to get any dose reduction, right? But the beautiful thing is kV is quadratic. It responds quadratically, and MA responds linearly. So we could actually use the physics of interaction to reduce the kV and increase MA and still get dose reduction. So here's a phantom. I imaged at 120 kV, 100 mass with a noise value. I just put a big old ROI here. The standard deviation was 7.6. The CTDI value was 6.8. Then I took this same phantom, imaged at 80 kV, same 100 mass. My noise went up, of course, because more photons were absorbed by the body. Less got to the detector. And my CTDI volume went down because, of course, kV went from 120 to 80. So that's great. Dose to the patient actually went down. Now, what happens if I go from 80 kV but I increase my MAS? So I go from 100 back up to 350. My noise was largely the same, 7.6 to 7.1, and my CTDI vol only went up to 5.8. So you can see that as you go from high kVs to low kVs, you do need to increase the MA. But that's okay, because dose reduces a lot faster with kV. Funniest story, when we turned on our new scanner a couple of years ago, and we started imaging at 80 kV, some of our patients were being imaged at 80 kV and 1300 MA. And I got some very frantic phone calls from our radiologists because they didn't notice the 80 kV part. They saw the 1300 MA, and they thought we were burning holes in our kids, our patients. And so I had to explain to them this very principle, hence the reason I made this slide. I had to show them that 80 kV, once we go from 120 to 80 kV, dose comes down, and then we compensate to make sure we get enough photons on the detector to get a good image by raising MA up. So even if we're imaging at 1300 MA, our doses have come down, as you saw in our one plot a couple slides ago. All right. Oh, this is all wrong. Okay. So we were talking yesterday, and we were going over kind of the auto profile that you guys have on one of your scanners here at this local hospital. And some of the questions were, what were the divisions that we personally used in our protocol setup? Excuse me. So this is how we do it. I'm not saying this is how you should do it, and I'm not saying this is how everyone else should do it. But what we typically have done is I have one abdomen protocol sitting on my scanner. And then on the background, I have this auto profile. And so depending on the scout, the dimension of the scout, the anterior, posterior, and the lateral measurement that's measured off the scout, if it's less than 30 centimeters, which is typically a patient that's pretty small, a little kid, less than 15 kilos, that patient is going to be imaged at 70 kV. So I tell the system, if it's less than that, pick the 70 kV, there's a noise index and all that other stuff, tube current, the min and max tube outputs for my tube current modulation, it's all set there. For our patients from 30 to 60 centimeters, we image at 80 kV. And this gets us up to kind of large teenagers, as I mentioned. And in this case, I allow the system to have a maximum of 1300 MA. And once you get up to those real big kids, it kind of does start and hit it starts hitting the top of the MA output. I set the 60 centimeters because if you go much higher than that, say 65 or even 70, then what happens is a screen will pop up in front of the technologist and say, the system will say, I cannot image this patient according to the noise index you have chosen with only 1300 MA. The system just literally says, I can't do this. So then you have to either accept noisier images or it gives you a couple other options. We didn't want our technologists to have to change the protocol on the fly like that. So we looked at our data in Radiometrics and we found the distribution of our patients. We looked at MA, max MA as a function of patient size. And we noticed that right about 60 centimeters, it hit that 13, it kind of plateaued at 1300 MA. And that's how we made this change. Or that's how we chose this value. And then anything over 60, we image at 100 kV. And once again, we have I think it's set at 900 MA. A couple things to talk about though. We made this choice. So the vast majority of our patients are imaged at 80 kV. And I allow it to go up to 1300. Actually talking to one of the CT technologists in the hospital yesterday, he mentioned that he actually only allows his system to go up to 900 because for the patient population that he images here in Thailand, he was running into tube heating problems if he allowed it to go all the way to 1300. And I thought that was a great example of optimization. So I wanted to include that on my slide. So they recognized, based on the patient population here, they optimized it as a function of the machine output. And so that's just, kudos to the CT technologists for making that choice. And then, of course, as we've kind of already talked about, we image all of our patients under 5 years old at 100 kV and everyone over 5 at 120. But we've already kind of talked about it. So that was just, I wanted to throw this slide in there because we had this conversation yesterday. What is another benefit of doing low kV imaging? Well, in pediatrics, in our world, you actually don't need to use as much IV contrast. The way it works here, I went out and I plotted iodine concentration. So I had a phantom and I put inside that phantom various different levels of concentration, anything ranging from about 2.5 milligrams per cc or per milliliter all the way up to 20. And then I imaged it, the phantom, at all the different KVs, and I normalized it by the CTDI vol. So I try to take the dose point out of this. And so what I wanted to do is then calculate the CNR from noise, the background, to the little insert rod that I created. And what you can see here is you go from 140 kV up towards 70 kV. If you pick a point horizontally, what you're saying is I want to maintain my CNR, my contrast to noise ratio, equally for each kV. So you can see here that at 140 kV, I need to use 15 milligrams per cc or milliliters. But if I were to be able to, so if we had a smaller kid image at 70 kV, you could see that I could actually reduce it to maybe 6 milligrams per milliliter and still have the same contrast to noise ratio. So low kV, because of the photoelectric effect, because of the K-age of iodine, it makes it possible for us to reduce our iodine concentration burden. And as Dr. Cannell mentioned yesterday, in the US, we've been facing some shortages, and so it's been very helpful. I should make one mention that, and I don't show the data here, I tested this on all different size phantoms. When you largely get up to adults or large adults, it's hard. You can't really do that. You can't use single energy CT scanners to reduce your iodine concentration in the adult population. But I will talk about that in my next talk. What's another technique to do that? Okay. Another thing we talked quite a bit about yesterday was noise, the metric that we use to optimize the tube current modulation. Noise index, or for Canon scanner, it's SD, which they're kind of equivalent, and Siemens quality reference mass. So I went in this morning and I added a bunch of slides just because we talked quite a bit about this yesterday. So when you go in to set up your protocols, I know you all know this, you're going to set up your protocols to image at the smallest detector option. So usually 0.625 if it's a GE, or 0.5 millimeters for all the other vendors. And then you're going to set your noise metric, noise index, SD, or quality reference mass, based on the idea that eventually you're going to sum up multiple detector elements worth and get a thicker slice. So our radiologists are going to do their diagnostic task on a thicker slice of the patient, usually 5 millimeters, maybe 2.5 millimeters, but they're not normally looking at the 0.625 millimeters for their primary read. Now, almost always if they have a question or if they just want to look at it, personally for us at our hospital, we send up our normal slices and we send up our thin slices so that our radiologists have both options. But you can see that noise is optimized in this image because I know that I'm going to sum up several of my slices. And because of that, I set my noise indice, and this number 30 is just a random number. So I'm not saying this image was done at 30. I'm saying just this number right here is optimized for the eventual end point tissue thickness. So don't set your noise index based on your thin slice, because unless you have to look at 0.625 millimeter images, because if you did, your dose is going to go pretty high and your 5 millimeter images are going to look phenomenally beautiful. All right, so we use the 0.625 because you want to image with the thinnest slices for your reformats, for your sagittal and coronals, and then I just mentioned all this, so I'll just kind of flip over that. So some basic, I wanted to kind of put, in my hospital, we have GE and Canon, and so they use noise index and SD values. So there's some really basic math that you can do if you want to know which noise index to use, or if you're starting at one noise index and you want to maybe reduce dose or increase dose, what's the next noise index? And so you can see here, there's just a couple of relationships. If you want your final dose, dose 2, you take your initial dose and you multiply it by the quadratic ratio of your two noise indices. So if you're starting with a 5 milligray dose, a CTDI volume of 5 milligray, and you go from 15, a noise indice of 15, but now you're reducing it to 10, so the image is going to be less noisy. Excuse me, I said that backwards. If you started with 10, but you go to 15, so your image is actually going to be a little noisier, you can see the dose, the output doses, the dose is almost cut in half. So you can see here, you didn't double the noise indice, but you did get a dose reduction of nearly half. So because of that quadratic relationship, we have the opportunity to really kind of play with that. And how does this play into it if you're thinking about thicknesses instead of dose? Well, it's kind of the same thing. So noise indices and thickness, T1, T2. So if you start with a noise index of 10 and you're going from a 3 millimeter to a 5 millimeter, no, you're going from a 5 millimeter down to a 3 millimeter, you would want to have your noise index be increased by 13. And if you don't increase your noise index, the image noise will go up by 30%. So I just put those in there. The other thing you need to think about is how each vendor uses those metrics: noise index, standard deviation, quality reference mass, and I can't remember what Philips calls it, but whatever Philips calls it. You can see that they actually operate largely different. GE and Canon are pretty similar. So for a given noise index or SD value, you can see there's kind of an exponential rise as a function of patient thickness. So low noise index, you can see here. For small patients, you're going to have relatively low, and the output here is tube current. The y-axis is tube current. You're going to have relatively low MA, but as the patient gets bigger, it's going to rapidly increase the amount of output to try to keep the noise at that roughly 5 value. And that's the same here. If you have maybe a higher noise index, obviously you're going to have a less aggressive rise in MA. So that's pretty straightforward with those two vendors. Siemens, which I know we looked at one of your guys' systems, their approach is to have different, weak, medium, strong type approach. If you have a weak curve, or if you select the weak curve, it's going to have a slower rise in MA overall, and a strong, it's going to start at a lower MA, but it's going to rapidly increase over that same patient thickness range. So each of them really look at this differently. The GE and Canon really raise up quickly. Your MAs will go up quickly. Dr. Cannell and I were talking about this yesterday. Some of the questions that one of the questions we were faced with was we were looking at a high-res chest protocol on one scanner and the other, and the CTDI vol value was much lower on one of the vendors. And as we were looking through it, basically we came to the conclusion that it's most likely the choice of the noise index on the one scanner versus the quality reference mass on the other scanner, and how you can see one doesn't rise as fast, whereas the other one rises faster. And so reducing the noise index on that one scanner would probably put it a little closer in line with what you see on the Siemens scanner. Now, how does that affect noise? So now the y-axis is noise, not tube current. So once again, what's going to happen is if you set a noise index of 1, 10, 15, 20, whatever, it's largely trying to keep the noise the same for GE. There is, these higher noise indices will actually drop off, so the image will get a little bit noisier with the really, really big patients. The Canon largely tries to stay flat, but it actually will kind of increase slightly, so noise will go up a little bit. The system allows it to get noisier as the patient gets bigger, and that's the same way Siemens and Philips also work. It understands the concept that a bigger patient will absorb a lot of those photons, and so a bigger patient can be noisier because they have a lot more adipose tissue. So a lot of, just the anterior part of the body is nothing really you're looking at, and there's a lot of interstitial fat. So there's a lot more inherent contrast in the center part of the body. So it could technically be a little bit noisier. And that's the concept that most vendors, except for one, they kind of they put into their calculation when they set up their profiles, their dose characteristic curves. All right, so I promised that I would go out and find this yesterday when we were talking. The question was, if we want to optimize the high-res chest CT, we have one vendor and another. They have two different noise metrics. One uses noise index for the GE, the other one uses Siemens quality reference mass. They respond very differently. So if you look at the volume CTDI on this first plot, you can see that the Siemens system will respond linearly across the quality reference mass. So if you set a higher quality reference mass, commensurately CTDI volume is going to go up. Set a lower one, volume is going to go down. Whereas on the GE system, noise index is exponential. So the higher the noise index, the higher the noise index, the lower yeah, that makes sense. It's Friday. I'm glad people are paying attention. But you see here that the dose will come down. But it goes down really quick. And after a while, you can see, after 30, 40, 50, 60, you really aren't getting that much difference in dose reduction. And then when you look at it as a function of noise, you can see here, if it's linear here, it's going to be exponential here. And if it's exponential here, it's largely going to be linear here. But it's not perfectly linear, as you remember on this plot right here, because for those high noise indices, it kind of tapers off a little. So that's why it's not perfectly linear. So the point here is, and I still, when I was talking to the team here, I mentioned that I was aware of a paper or a talk or something where someone actually did a good they compared which quality reference mass value would be equivalent to which noise index value. I couldn't find that talk last night as I was thumbing through the literature, but I do promise I'll keep looking. I'm sure I'll find it, and I'll just have to email that to you guys. But until then, here you can at least see these exponential, you can see these relationships, and if you go to this publication, if I remember right, Sarah, Dr. McKinney, she actually provided equations. So you can still use the equations similarly, but I'll keep looking. All right, I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk that kind of the two big areas that I wanted to focus on was AI. And we already talked yesterday quite a bit about how AI impacts image quality. So how does it impact dose? Or how could it impact dose? I should preface everything I'm about to say with the fact that we don't do it. What we do when we did is we turned on we went from iterative reconstruction to deep learning reconstruction, and we simply turned it on. We did not actually decrease our dose. We wanted to give our radiologists, because we love our radiologists, we wanted to give them a little less noise and a little better image quality. As Dr. Canal has pointed out quite a few times, we use a lot less dose than probably a lot of other people. When you look at our values compared to the national DRLs in the US, we're about 15 to 20%. So we're pretty darn low. But what if you did want to use deep learning reconstruction to do some kind of noise dose reduction? So what I did is I took our ACR Phantom, just like you guys have. I went and I scanned it, fixed MA. I started at 300 and then I just scanned it and scanned it and scanned it all the way down to 10 MAS. So basically as low as the machine will go. And then I went in using that software that I gave you guys, that link I gave you in yesterday's talk. I calculated the noise power spectrum. And I mentioned to you that we have two vendors with two different deep learning reconstruction algorithms. One is Canon, one is GE. And here you can see the noise power spectrums from the 300 MAS, obviously very low noise. That's why they're very low down here, all the way up to the low dose, so really high noise. And you can see that they both behave the same. But a couple other things I will point out is one, as you go down, obviously it gets noisier and noisier and noisier. And so you can kind of see that the magnitude of my y-axis is much different. It's about a factor of 7 different. Whereas on this one, as I keep going down, 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 the noise actually doesn't really increase with Canon. So you can see here, we only get up to a y-axis value that's roughly about 80, 90, whereas this one goes all the way up to about 600, 700. So we have to look at the metrics that I talked about yesterday, the overall noise magnitude ratio and the center shift, or the CFR, the central frequency ratio. And so that's what I did. So here's the center frequency ratio. And you can see that as you, starting at that 300 MAS level, as I then decrease the dose and I used ACE, shown here in blue, or True Fidelity, shown here in red, you can see the center frequency ratio shifts pretty substantially for one vendor, and it actually does change for the other vendor, but it goes up. And so if I just flip back, you can see here that the one vendor where it actually goes up, you can see the noise gets a little more sandy, actually gets a little more edgy. Whereas as the noise, in this one, where remember the center frequency ratio tapered off, you can see that noise, and it's probably hard to see because I only give you just a teeny little snapshot, but the noise gets softer. The edge of this little insert is a little more fuzzy. I hope you can see that. It's a little more fuzzy compared to all the way out here. It's a little softer, I should say, not fuzzy. And then the noise magnitude ratio for the one vendor, for the ACE, noise does go up. The noise magnitude does go up, but it doesn't go up that much. And then the other one, noise goes up pretty substantially. The relationship of those two systems is based purely on how the AI technology was trained and implemented. So the Canon system trained and deployed its AI using model-based iterative reconstruction. All of its ground truth, less noise images were based on model-based imaging. And so I hate doing this, but I'm going to do it just to show you. So they based all of their noiseless images off of these type of images right here. Not noisy, but they tend to be a little softer. And the other vendor, they used filter back projection only, GE. So they had really high dose and low dose filter back projected images. And so that's why you don't see a shift in the center frequency for the GE one, but you do see a shift for the ACE. But the ACE, because it uses really good iterative reconstruction, noise just doesn't change that much. So putting all this together, what we found was that you could see let's see. Okay, so if you didn't want to let noise texture change, so if you wanted to go from, say, a traditional filter back projected image, but you reduce the dose a little and you turn up iterative reconstruction to clean up the noise, after about 20 to 30% dose reduction, your iterative reconstruction will start to, will keep removing noise, but it starts to change the texture. It starts to soften the image, which we all know that's what we've dealt with for dealt with over the last decade. So several publications have come out and said, if you don't want to see the change in the softening of the boundaries in your image using iterative reconstruction, dose reduction should really be held to be 20 to 30%. Well, the deep learning reconstruction algorithm I found, based on the slides I showed a minute ago, was that you could go about 70%, specifically for one vendor, but largely for the other vendor too. You can go about 70% without changing the noise texture. The biggest trade-off for that, though, is the noise magnitude ratio. So if you're going from basically here to about 190, you can see one will increase a little bit more noise than the other. But if you go that same ratio right here, the overall change, so here's one, everything's based off of one, you can see that the noise texture really largely stays the same. It might actually be a little sharper than the other vendor. So, can we use deep learning reconstruction for dose reduction? The answer is yes. Yes, you can, and it's actually going to be a little bit more robust than using iterative reconstruction. But as I mentioned, as I mentioned at the beginning, we actually don't use it for deep learning reconstruction. We don't use it for dose reduction. But what about low contrast detectability? So once again, I used my ACR Phantom. I wanted to try, I dug through all my data and I wanted to show this based on stuff, because I know you guys mentioned you just bought an ACR Phantom. It's actually a very versatile Phantom you can use. So there's a part in, there is a section in the Phantom that shows low contrast. You can see there's 4 little dots right there. They have specific contrast to background ratio. And I imaged it, and these are 6 millimeters wide, by the way. I imaged it at almost 50% dose reduction. So I started at 210 mass. I largely reduced it by 50%, and then just a little less than 50% again. And I did it using filter back projection. I used iterative reconstruction, and I used deep learning. So as you go this way down, you can see that the noise does reduce. There's less noise in this than this. Oops, sorry. And that's true across all of the bottom here. And as you go this way, of course, noise becomes much more intense, and it actually, in my opinion, kind of, it makes it difficult to see those 4 objects right here. I would argue maybe you could see them here. And I think you can still kind of see them here, but they're still mostly obscured. The point I'm trying to make is that as I reduced the dose, deep learning reconstruction did not provide low contrast recovery. And the same thing with iterative reconstruction. So that is something that you need to take into account when you are reducing dose. You will never regain that low contrast detectability, because when you reduce dose, you're fundamentally reducing signal on the detector. Now, iterative reconstruction and deep learning is really good about cleaning up some of the variability, but there's literally no signal on the detector. It can't add signal back. So you're not going to go from this beautiful, well, better looking image over here where I can really distinctly see these 4-6 millimeter low contrast nodules, and over here all of a sudden they're just glowing and pop right out. So you have to understand, when you reduce dose, you are going to sacrifice something. Here, this is the same Phantom, but now it's a 5 millimeter, and so it's much harder to see. I would argue you could still see it at this 210 mass level for all, even the filtered back projection. But then as you go, it's definitely lost here. Maybe, possibly you can see it a little bit because the noise is cleaned up. But I didn't gain the ability to see 5 millimeter anymore at using deep learning that I did with iterative reconstruction or filter back projection. So there's just that caveat. Just wanted to put that caveat out there. Lower doses are great because we're reducing the dose to our patient, and the iterative reconstruction and the deep learning algorithms do a great job at really cleaning up the variability. But if you have really small, subtle, low contrast objects, if that's the detection task you're faced with, our radiologists still need photons on those detectors. All right, so quickly conclusion, we reviewed dose reduction strategies, and I am of the opinion that only imaging when it's necessary or using appropriateness criteria is the best #1 optimization tool. The second would be tube current modulation. Make sure you set it up properly using proper size-based or weight-based protocols. Make sure your patient's centered properly. I like to use organ dose modulation. I really think it helps with obviously the eyes for the brain imaging, but it can reduce anything anterior such as breast tissue or thyroid dose. And then low kV imaging, as I've demonstrated, is great for the body and for largely infant or young baby or young kids' heads. All right, deep learning reconstruction can be used for deep dose reduction. I demonstrated down to about 70% without affecting image noise texture, with the caveat that it will not improve your low contrast detectability. All right, that was the first talk.
Thank you so much, Sam, for the very informative lecture. Any questions from the audience here? Okay. Seem like you talk about deep learning and AI. It's like in every step that we have like a deep learning or AI, like a patient positioning, dose reduction, tube current, or whatsoever. Is it like in the clinical practice already?
For the deep learning?
Yes.
I believe so. I think as we talk to them, you guys have it, right?
And do we use it here in Thailand?
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Do you have it on both GE and Canon or just GE? Just GE. Okay. Yeah, because at least from the data you showed me, you guys have a lot of primes. I didn't know if you had any like Genesis or Aquilians.
Canon kind of advertised it during our last year radiology congress, but I'm not sure if any hospital bought it already. I have not heard. With the AI one, no, I don't think so. But GE, they got quite a number already.
That's good. I mean, I'm personally a fan of both. We have both GE and Canon. It just turned out that we had the two vendors that came out with AI first, and our doctors we had ACE first. They loved ACE, and then we got True Fidelity, and they love True Fidelity. ACE has come out with their second generation. It's called Peak, Canon has come out with their second generation. It's called Peak, and it's phenomenal because they took the Canon precision scanner. Instead of having 0.5 millimeter detectors, has 0.25 millimeter detectors, so it's a high resolution scanner. And they took the data off of that, and they used that for their training. So now when you image with a 0.5 millimeter, 0.5 millimeter thick detector, you get 0.25 millimeter like resolution using AI. It's beautiful. It's only being used right now for cardiac. You can go online and Google it. PIQE, I think is Peak. But yeah, so all the vendors are working this way. Philips, I think, told me that they'll have one in the next coming year, 2024, so in about a year or so. And so that's just the direction we're all going. And it's great for dose reduction. It's great for image quality improvement and good for dose reduction if you want to go that way.
I think people here, especially the physicists, they need to utilize the phantom that they have more than just using the phantom for annual testing. Yeah, like if you can utilize the phantom that you have for clinical settings, like testing the protocols, that would help a lot.
Yeah.
Like you can get like the characteristic of image quality versus the dose that you use in your local protocol.
Yeah. So the ACR phantom it's limited in the sense that it's just a cylinder. It's one diameter. You can buy annulus rings, so you can insert the ACR phantom and make it a fat phantom.
Yeah, we do have.
You have those? That's great.
Yeah.
Actually, I think I saw a picture of you holding one. Yeah. So you can do it such that you can mimic different patient sizes. The phantom, as we did talk about this yesterday, it's not perfect, but it gives you a really good. So I did this analysis right here. I went through this exercise. I wouldn't go in and turn my scanners on to 90 mass, but I know that there's a certain point, roughly about the 60-70% point, where I'm going to start losing texture. And so if I were to go into the clinic and do a dose reduction, I would feel very comfortable reducing probably around the 50% level, just turning it there without concern. And after that, I'd probably then start inching it down and using radiologists to make sure I got it right. So phantoms are good to get you in the ballpark. And you can use the phantoms all different ways.
Okay.
Nowadays we have the dual energy CT scan, right? So when we compare the dual energy CT with the single energy CT, when we talk about the radiation dose, what is the dose, radiation dose that we will get the benefit from the dual energy? What is?
So I couldn't have paid her more because that's my second talk. We're going to talk all about dual energy next. So she set me up perfectly for my second talk.
Okay. Hey, I think I may need to check at my hospital over there about the reconstruction that using AI and deep learning because I'm not sure that I see the images on those things before.
Okay. I mean, there's a chance. When we got it, we put it, installed it. We talked to our chief radiologist of each of like the body section, head section, all that, just like Dr. Canal does with her protocol team. And they all agreed to turn it on. We turned it on. We didn't hide it from all of our radiologists, but we didn't necessarily like broadcast it widely. And we actually had quite a few radiologists like, oh, wow, things just look a little better. And so,
And did you label as like that this is a deep learning reconstruction? Okay.
yeah, as people started to realize there was a difference, we eventually got all the data together and did a little in-service. If they
Depending on the vendor and pack system you have, it will actually show on the image that you're using deep learning. So for us, I think we have GE just like you. It shows, I think, DLIR,
yeah,
MED,
DLIR, M, or
something like
whatever,
that. Yeah.
Yeah, but it depends also. Our PAC system on the hanging protocol, they turn that off, so they don't see that.
Because I believe that I don't see that things when I read the study over there in the US. Because we have the Philips for the spectral CT,
don't have
Siemens,
it.
okay,
Yep.
Siemens as a
Siemens
dual
doesn't have it
energy.
either.
Okay, so that's why I don't see
That
it.
is why you don't see it. Yeah.
Oh, okay, I hear you.
Thailand's
Yeah.
better.
Better than Indiana. I hear you, Napapong, I hear you. Okay, so there is a questions from the online audience.
Oh, yeah.
So does it matter whether the lateral or AP sonogram is done first?
Historically, it was. Not so much anymore. And Kalpana can correct me if I'm wrong. If you start with the AP and then do your lateral, or you do your lateral view and then your AP, the tube current modulation will work fine. Because usually if you do both of them, the system takes measurements from both, and then it's able to calculate how much MA it needs as it spins around the body. As I mentioned, the whole reason we do our lateral first is so we can make sure our patient is centered. Because if you started AP, and then if you had to move them left or right, and then you did the lateral, and you actually had to like move them up and down, you might have to do the AP again because you have to move them. So for us, we just do lateral projection first so we can get them centered up and down, and then we do the AP to make sure they're positioned right and all that, and then we set our scan range off the AP.
Anything to comment add on? Oh, okay, hold on, one more.
So for the pediatric that you recommend us for the like a KV that we should use for each weight band, something like that, and which organ that we should not use the low KV.
So for example, we do use 70 for the little kids, but we do not use 70 for much greater than. And once again, I want to just preface this. This is how we do it. So you need to look at your patient population. Where did I put it? And there. We found that 70 kV, your body will absorb 70 kV really easily. It's just a low kV. And so you have to have a small body to use 70 kV. You would need a lot higher MA output to use 70 kV. I personally don't like to use 70 kV a lot. I feel like there's still, unless I showed you a bunch of data, I don't know if I could explain it well, but the bones really absorb a lot of that 70 kV. And so if the radiologists need to look at fine detail in the bones, it's harder. We've had some of our radiologists complain about the 70 kV images, saying the bones looked translucent. They just don't look right. And it's because 70 kV just absorbs all those photons. So there's not a lot of detail in the bone. And so for us, our doctors, our radiologists love 80 kV. And so imaging at 80 kV when you're doing, say, like a CTA, so then there's iodine on board, those images just look beautiful. I mean, our doctors love our CTAs on our system when we image at 80 kV. And we can largely image up to about 60 centimeters. So for us, I would probably be 100 kV, but someone maybe a little smaller than me could probably still be imaged at 80 kV through the abdomen and the chest. And so when you're doing anything with iodine contrast, low KV makes the image look great because the iodine just absorbs those photons. And so it really stands out from the normal background tissue, say in the liver or wherever else you're looking. That said, as I mentioned, as we all saw yesterday, we were talking as we were in the hospital talking to the one technologist that ran that scanner. He mentioned that he was just having some problems with tube heating when he used 80 kV up to 1300 MA. So that would probably work great for 1 or 2 or 3 patients, but if you got patients back to back to back to back, at some point your tube will heat up at 1300 MA. And so he felt that it was best to keep it limited to 900. So that's why he had your guys' scanner doesn't go all the way up to 60 centimeters for that band of weights, AP lat. I can't remember. I think it was 50, but I can't remember. Yeah, so I have 3, you guys have 4 divisions. And that's great if that works for your patient population. So like I said, the way I determined that is I went into Radiometrics. My y-axis was my max MA output. My x-axis was my patient dimension, the AP plus lat. And I just plotted it. And it eventually just kind of curved off. It looked like a logarithm. It just flattened out at the 1300 MA. And then once I saw where it hit 1300 MA, that was the point in which I said, okay, I don't want to go any higher than that. And that was roughly, it was like 62, 63 centimeters. So that's why I put my upper limit at 60. So that I know, and I don't have this problem anymore, a patient up to 60 centimeters in AP plus lat dimension won't ever hit my 1300 MA. It gets close, but it won't hit it. That's a great question.
Okay. Oh, one more here. Is it legally required to state the use of AI or DRL in radiological report? Do we need to? No.
In the US, no. It's not legally required to say that it was done either with filter back rejection, iterative, or AI. And the reason for that, for the US, is we have an agency called the FDA, the Federal Drug and Administration.
So this is like
But basically what happened is the vendors, GE and Canon, submitted their data to the FDA, and the FDA looked at the data and said, this is okay, this is safe for patients, and because they got the FDA stamp of approval, we can legally use those algorithms, those softwares, without any concern. So that's why. Yeah, Food and Drug Administration. Yeah, the FDA just covers medical, but it is, as Dr. Kamal just said, it's the food
G
and
and
drug.
Canon. Okay.
Yeah.
So
I imagine you guys probably have something similar for.
Exactly the same, and whatever US FDA say, our FDA just says so.
we follow you.
And it's true because we kind of do the same thing back and forth with Europe. When Europe approves something, our FDA, they drag their feet, but eventually approve it.
Okay, sounds good. So G and Canon that has a deep learning.
Yep.
Okay.
And there are 2 versions out there. There's ClariPy, which was developed in South Korea, and AlgoMedica, which is developed in the US, I think in California. Those are independent. So you could buy those options, those algorithms, and you could reconstruct using Hitachi, UI, Siemens, Philips, even GE if you wanted to, if you didn't have True Fidelity, or on your Canon scanners, if you don't have ACE, you could go buy AlgoMedica or ClariPy.
It's like the software add-on that like
so the scan goes from the machine, you reconstruct it using whatever, say iterative reconstruction, filter back. It goes to a server, the AlgoMedica or the ClariPy, cleans it up, and then it pushes it to PACS.
Oh, okay. So external, like a software, software to do like a post-processing
It's a
something.
post-processing,
Yeah.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Okay.
And so you can look in it if you wanted to.
No, I don't have power to make that decision, but it's good to know that they have like the extra software if they want to have some like the AI something to plug in with the CT that we already have. Okay. Oh, hold on. Let's see this question. So someone from Kun Edward from Hong Kong said Hong Kong's follow the FDA too.
Awesome.
So we follow
There you
you
go.
guys. Yep. Okay, so we can switch to your next talk about the dual energy.
All right. Yep.
That's okay. No problem. We love to learn from you guys. Yeah, we have time. No
Oh,
worries. No
okay.
worries. Yeah.
I'm long-winded.
No worries. Take your time. We want to hear from you.
Okay. It's Tanya's fault if I take 2 hours. All right. So, great setup. The next question, the question a couple minutes ago was, well, how do these techniques, dose, optimization, all that kind of stuff, deal with dual energy? So spectral CT dual energy is kind of that, we've had it for a while. This is not new technology. I remember in 2005 at a hospital I was at, we installed the first 2-tube system, and we were able to start doing dual energy. So we've been doing that for just shy of 2 decades now. But it's not that well. Most places have some dual energy capability, but I would argue most people don't use dual energy. But the reality is, most of the vendors nowadays have put a lot of effort, funding, and investigation into developing what's called photon counting. And so let's talk about why dual energy and photon counting are probably the future of CT. Dual energy CT. So this gentleman right here, this is Dr. Godfrey Hounsfield. He is the gentleman that invented the CT scanner. And that's why all the CT numbers in our scanner have units of Hounsfield units, because they all look like that guy. Whoa, sorry. There we go. So dual energy CT is the application of reconstructing an image when you acquire an image of the body using 2 different kilovoltages or 2 different spectrum. The dual energy is not new. Dr. Hounsfield, was actually using dual energy imaging back in 1973. He would do 100 kV and then 140 kV, and he was trying to distinguish the difference between iodine and calcium. Dual energy largely didn't catch on then because, of course, it took 3 to 4 minutes to image a patient, and so a lot of things happen in those 3 to 4 minutes. The heart beats, the lungs breathe, the liver moves up and down. And so it's really hard to spatially, temporally align the body parts for 1 kV and another kV if there's a lot of movement. So, which we'll talk about in a minute, but dual energy really needs to happen with fast acquisition so that when we acquire the heart or the lungs in 1 kV, it's in kind of the same position of the second. This is a great resource. AAPM came out with Task Group 291. For those members that have, for those people that have access to AAPM, you can go there, or if you just go to the Medical Physics Journal, you can also download it from there. So if you have access to both of those, either of those, you can do it. This is the task group is actually an educational task group. So it talks about what is dual energy and how do we use it, and it kind of just talks a little bit about all this. So most of my talk comes from this resource. You will see that, for example, down here, this is the citation for that resource. So as an example, we know that the body has all different kinds of tissues, right? It has muscle, soft tissue, of course, and it's got bone and whatnot. And we know there are two fundamental radiation interactions with the body. So in the CT range, when we're looking at soft tissue, the fundamental way X-rays interact with our body is through the Compton effects, Compton scatter effect. For bone or other high attenuating materials such as like iodine contrast, the fundamental interaction is through the photoelectric effect. And because there is a distinction in the way the photons, the X-rays, interact with these 2 different materials, we can distinguish which is which using dual energy. So as an example, you can see here at high kV, we are almost fundamentally only imaging using Compton scattering. But at the lower energies, so 80 kV, we're going to be imaging with a little bit of photoelectric effect and then Compton. And because of that, just a little bit more photoelectric effect at 80 kV versus 140, you can see there's a lot more attenuation of the iodine. And so iodine looks different than calcium. Whereas over here, iodine and calcium, Hounsfield unit-wise, are basically the same. So the goal here is we need to acquire 2 images at the same location at 2 different photon energies. And we typically are going to use a lower energy, somewhere at 80 kV is probably typical. Some scanners will use 70. And then we need to pick another kV that's much higher. So typically it's going to be 140, could be 150. The point here is you're going to acquire two, and you're going to have two Bremsstrahlm spectrums, and they're going to somewhat overlap, but there's going to be parts of them that are distinct and different. And the goal here for dual energy CT is to come up with a mechanism to separate these two spectrum. You want the low energy to be largely different than the high energy, and you want to maximize that. And so the way you can do that, of course, there's lots of different ways, and each vendor has their approach, and we'll talk about in a minute. But one of the main approaches is some vendors will use filtration. So for 1 kV, there will be certain filtration, and another kV, there'll be like a tin filter or an aluminum filter, and that causes a larger separation of the two spectrum. The way dual energy CT works, as I mentioned, is you need to have a sufficient difference in atomic number and the K edge. So that works great for things like iodine, because iodine is pretty darn different than, say, calcium down here, and definitely soft tissue. Now, calcium is still sufficiently different than soft tissue, but down here, you got soft tissue such as muscle and whatnot, and then fat. There's very little difference down there. And so it's pretty easy right now for us to distinguish or differentiate between these attenuating properties such as iodine and calcium, because they themselves are different from each other, and it's easy to differentiate iodine and calcium from soft tissue and fat. So as I mentioned, every vendor kind of has their approach and how they do it. So I want to just do a quick review of what they are and the advantages and disadvantages. So on the Siemens system, they have a dual source. One of their systems is a dual source, and each tube will be able to operate at different kV values, and they are actually able to separate them even more by putting, as I said, different filtration in one of the beam paths. And so you can get really good separation of the spectrum. What are the limitations? Even on their newest system, the Force, there are still somewhat limited because the second tube, the detector ring, has to be just a little smaller than the first one. And that's just because there's physically not enough space inside the gantry to put two equally large size detectors. So because of that, there is a place inside the image that will be able to display dual energy, and then there's a space outside of that that would be able to will only display the single energy or that higher kV. And so you just have to understand where your body anatomy is if you have a large patient with respect to what will be processed for dual energy versus single energy. All right, and then there is some effect because you have two tubes. You can do scattering, scatter from one will go into the other, and the system technically is 90 degrees apart, a little less, a little more, but that means that when you're imaging this part of the body, it will take a rotation of 90 degrees before the second X-ray kV will image that same piece of that same anatomical location. I did forget to mention one of the benefits of this is you can actually do tube current modulation on both of these. So you can do really low dose dual energy imaging with this system. The other more very common one is what's called fast switching. So now what's going to happen for your GE and Canon, newer Canon scanners, as the X-ray tube spins around the body, it's going to quickly go from high to low, usually going to jump from between 80 and 140 kV. The advantage of this, because it's only using one tube and one detector, you can use the full 50 centimeter field of view, so there are no limitations. It does go fairly fast. Spatiotemporally, there's very little difference between the 80 and the 140. So they line up. They line up, obviously, the body anatomies of the two different spectra. They line up better than the two tubes that are 90 degrees apart. Yeah, that's what I said. Material decomposition is performed in sonogram space. That's good. All right. Yep. And AI has come a long ways. It used to be that the system, I'll mention this in let me just put it this way. They use AI now, so as you go from 80 to 140 kV, obviously there's a point when you switch kVs that the body's not being imaged by one of those kVs. So if you do 40, 140, 80, 140, 80, every time the 80 is being acquired, there is no data on the 140 sinogram. So they use AI now to fill in all that missing data. So now you have a perfectly filled in 140 and a perfectly filled in 180 kV sinogram. So when you do image quality, when you do the reconstruction, you get really good image quality, and you can also do dose reduction now using tube current modulation, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So you can't use separate filters. You can't get the filter in and out, so you don't get as good a spectral separation. There is still some signal contamination from the low and high kV because you can't just switch perfectly. There is going to be a little tail, a little rise, and a little decrease. So there is a little bit of signal contamination, which I'll demonstrate what that means in a little bit. So there is a little bit more noise in the images. The system can only spin at 0.5 seconds, so it might not be as feasible to do it dual energy CT in cardiac imaging. Okay, Philips uses actually two types of detectors, one stacked on the other with a filter in between. And what that does is when the photons come here, the lower energy photons are going to be absorbed superiorly, and then the only... Oh, thank you. I forgot to turn this on. And then, so the photons come here, the low energies get absorbed here, the high energies get absorbed, get passed through and get absorbed on the second detector. So effectively, once again, they can do 50 centimeter imaging. There we go. But effectively, they're only using one kV, either 120 or 140, typically 120. And so they're actually not switching. They're not doing anything with two different kVs. It's just one spectrum. But because they can separate out the high and low energy, they're able to get perfect spatial temporal registration. So they have no problems aligning the anatomy because they require perfectly spatial temporally and coincidental. And the beautiful thing about this, and Philips will be quick to tell you this, that means you don't have to know beforehand that you're going to do a dual energy protocol. So for like the Siemens and GE and Canon we just talked about in the previous slides, the radiologist and the technologist have to protocol the exam to be a dual energy, because you can't go from single energy back to dual energy. Whereas here, you can acquire this in a single energy, and then if you decide, I want a little bit more information, you can simply reconstruct it for dual energy. It's always dual energy and always single energy. You just have both. So you don't actually have to change any workflow. You don't have to change new protocols. Everything is just there. And interestingly, there was a study where they looked at how often would they have used dual energy compared to when they acquired it as a single energy. So they acquired 118 patients, and they looked at the fact that only 20% of the time they would have from the clinical indication ordered a dual energy scan. But they realized of those 118 patients, ultimately, 80% of the time they wanted dual energy, so they reconstructed it using dual energy. So what they were trying to prove in this publication is that, yeah, we actually do want dual energy imaging a lot more than we do. And so having the ability to flip back and forth is a great advantage. Another advantage, because there is no scatter contamination from two tubes or no contamination of signal from the switching, you actually have fairly uniform noise in the Philips system. So we'll talk about the virtual monoenergetic images in a minute, but basically you can see the noise is consistent here. But because of the scattering contamination in Siemens and the switching contamination, the lower KEV, the lower VMIs are a lot noisier in those two units. All right, limitations. Obviously, you're only going to be able to separate the spectrum so much because it's technically 1 kV, and you're just hoping you'll absorb the right amounts in both detectors. And so there is some material discrimination, being able to distinguish between, calcium iodine versus calcium, say, soft tissue. It is somewhat limited in that regard. All right, then there are other systems that do what's called spin-spin. Canon is one of them. And basically what it does is it spins twice around the body, once at 1 kV, once at another kV. So it's a lot slower, but you can do dual energy with any of the systems because it just has the ability to. The beautiful thing with this is you can actually do, tube current modulation. You can do all the typical things you do. The biggest limitation, though, is the fact that you have to spin twice around the same part of the anatomy. So there is going to be a difference in spatial temporal alignment. And so if you're doing an angiographic, a CTA of anything, the 80 kV and then say the 140 kV would have different, the blood would be flowing, the iodine would be different. And so it would just look different. So that's just a minimal thing. And then there's what's called split beam. And so the Siemens system will actually take the normal beam and they put a filter halfway through it. And so half of the beam will have one spectrum and the other half of the beam will have another spectrum. For example, here with like this tin filter and versus the normal like gold or aluminum filter. And then as it spins around and the body passes through, it basically images every part of the body using those two separate spectrums twice. This images every piece of the body twice, but with those two different spectrums. So all the same effects that we talked about with the spin are the same. Spatial temporal resolution is not very well aligned. But once again, you can do tube current modulation and all that. All right. What about, I didn't talk about Shimatsu, Hitachi, United Imaging. I couldn't find anything in literature, but basically everything I read on their website says, yes, they can do dual energy CT, but I just don't know how or why. So you just have to go with that. So what does dual energy or spectral CT provide for us? Well, once we've acquired these two different spectrum, we can analyze them separately and we can see the different attenuation profiles of all of the material in the body. And one of the things we can do is create what's called a virtual monoenergetic image. So we can create any number of images as if the body was imaged at that particular energy. So 40 keV, 50, 60, 70, all the way up to any high number, 100, 120, 140, 150 keV. You can slice and dice this as many ways as you want. And the beautiful thing is at the lower KeVs, you're going to have a ton more attenuation characteristics. So you're going to have really strong contrast. Whereas as you go all the way up to the higher level of VMIs, now you're going to have very little contrast, but the image noise is much lower here. And then on the GE and Canon and Siemens systems, the lower VMIs, they will be a lot noisier. Now Philips, because of the dual layer, as I mentioned, they're able to keep noise consistent in all their VMIs. And GE and Canon have now come out with AI that helps, excuse me, not Canon, but Canon's coming out with theirs, but GE is, no, I think they both have it. But anyway, they use their AI to clean up the noise in all of their dual energy. So it's really only now Siemens that has to kind of deal with that differential of noise. So what do you get? Obviously, you can see at the lower KeVs, you can start to see things just show up differently. They can just appear differently. And we'll talk about virtual non-contrast in a second. All right, so how do you handle image noise in a dual energy CT? Obviously, you can use iterative reconstruction or you can use deep learning, and that's a good way to get the noise out of your low and high KVs so that you have mostly uniform image noise in your VMIs. There are reconstruction algorithms out there like HyperL that are used to try to minimize that, but it's just all algorithmic approaches. How do we optimize the noise parameters in dual energy CT? We need to establish those noise targets. So, noise index as an example for GE, that would be used to optimize noise for 120 kV. So you want to pick the whatever noise index you would normally have if you were imaging a patient with a normal single energy 120 kV acquisition, even though you're going to acquire it at 140 and 80, fast switched. And then what will end up happening is as you process it all and you get all your different VMIs, the noise index would look appropriate as if it was 120 kV. All right. And this will also help you set your CTDI value because it's based off the NI. Yep, and it'll optimize its MA. I just said that. The resulting noise. Yep. Okay, so 70 keV on those VMIs is the one that looks the most similar to 120 kV single energy acquisition. So if our doctors are very used to looking at all of our, say, adult abdomens at 120 kV, then imaging with 70 keV, imaging dual energy and reconstructing it with a 70 keV would give you the similar feel for the noise and all that kind of stuff. So I mentioned not dose reduction, but iodine contrast reduction can happen with single energy, but only really for pediatrics. If you look at the adult population, we're just limited because the body absorbs too much of the photons. But when you go to dual energy now you can play with the different virtual monoenergetics. You have all these different images with different contrast levels. And in a study that I partnered with Stanford and a couple other universities in the US, what we did is we acquired a bunch of images with dual energy. So we did it with all the different vendors and all the different approaches. And we calculated CNR and we used phantoms, I should say. We used phantoms. So we calculated CNR in those phantoms after we processed the VMIs at 40, 50, 60, 70, and 80 keV. And what we found in a similar fashion as I demonstrated in my last talk was that if you have your iodine concentration here along the x-axis, if you want equal contrast to noise ratio, you can then switch from 1, here black, this is 120 keV, if that was your default from your original non-dual energy. Now if you switch down to say 70 keV, which is red, you could reduce the amount of iodine by a little less than half. Or if you wanted to even go down lower to 50 keV all the way down here, you can reduce it more. We found basically maximum reductions of iodine contrast down around 60% if you use the really low keV VMIs. So dual energy is a phenomenally good way to reduce your iodine concentration. Good for patients that maybe have limited kidney function, but you still want to use iodine. Or like we ran into the issue we ran into in the US where we just plain ran out of iodine. All right, so what else can you get besides virtual monoenergetic images? You can do what's called tissue decomposition. Excuse me, because we know which material is which based on their different attenuation properties. We can actually figure that out and take a particular material out of the image. So we can subtract. For example, we can remove the bone, or in what's called a virtual non-contrast, we can remove iodine. So this was actually an iodine enhanced image. It was acquired with dual energy, and we simply just removed all signal related to iodine. The differentiation can also help us distinguish between some things such as gout or pseudo-gout, which I know you guys have mentioned you have that protocol, iodine versus calcium, etc. All right, here's uric acid, non-uric acid, so calcium-based, so being able to distinguish, the calcium base. And here's more gout versus more gout images. You guys have seen that. Interesting enough, for example, you can do like a silicone. You can identify things beyond just calcium and iodine. So here you got an extracapillary silicone in the breast tissue. You can distinguish what is metal artifact, what is metal, and you can help suppress metal artifact using dual energy. Dual energy also helps find things that are largely hidden because it's distinguishing the different tissue types. So hidden clinical diagnosis, myocardial perfusion, just kind of shows up like a light bulb here when you're looking at the iodine quantification map versus just a normal 120 kV single energy CT. You can also, like here, the gallstone on this normal, whatever, 120 kV image, one would argue you can't, maybe it's there. There is a subtle translucency there, but in dual energy, that thing pops out without a question. And then interestingly enough, you can even get into the concept of setting up, actually doing quantitation. So for example, with iodine quantitation, this publication, they looked at establishing indications of renal carcinoma, renal cell carcinoma, saying is it there or not renal carcinoma. And they said that if you go in iodine concentration, make your measurements, and it's greater than 4.8 milligrams per milliliter, this is indicative of this disease type. So now you're going to be able to actually use it as a predictive tool instead of just visually saying, oh, yep, there is tumor or no tumor. Now you can say it's actually probably indicative of, for example, RCC. All right, so the issues with dual energy we've already talked about. What limits the ability to distinguish two different tissue types or decomposition accuracy? Overlapping beam spectra. So as I mentioned, the farther we separate those for dual energy, the better. Image noise, we already talked quite a bit about that. Beam hardening artifacts, this is going to obviously happen because we are using very low kV, so we get we get low, because of the low KVs and higher attenuation and the high KVs, the beam hardening is different between the two spectrums. And so you will see an effect of beam hardening in the image. And scatter, we talked about that. So a couple of comments about misconceptions, especially for virtual non-contrast. Measurements of iodine concentration in the iodine image are not equal to the physical concentration of iodine. So even though it's an iodine what am I trying to say here? Yeah, in the virtual, I don't know what I'm trying to say here. I think I miswrote. Yeah, that line right there is wrong. I'll remove that before I send you. I don't know what I was trying to write there. But when you're looking at the virtual non-contrast image, the actual CT numbers of fat and muscle and soft tissue are actually different because you're physically removing signal from the image. And so you have to just recognize that. In this publication from Usman Mahmoud, he looked at, for example, hemorrhagic cysts and hypodense focal fat deposits. They may not necessarily appear the same in a virtual non-contrast. And that's just because when you're subtracting signal and you're subtracting iodine from a virtual non-contrast, you're actually not only subtracting iodine, or you might be leaving a little bit behind. It's not a perfect subtraction. So you have to be careful that a lot of people have used VNCs to remove the contrast, non-contrast, the dual phase scan. And that's probably appropriate in most cases. But if you're looking for specific clinical indicators, such as you're looking for hemorrhagic cysts or you're trying to do a follow-up in that regard, you have to be careful that VNCs may not be appropriate and you might still need to do an actual two-phase. All right, so I mentioned 70 keV mono image. Yeah, okay, so in that paper also, when they were looking at different radiologists actually preferred the iodine concentrated images with water subtracted when they overlaid that for looking for vascular conspicuity versus just looking at the 70 keV with normal iodine on board. So there are these tools where once you know what's water or soft tissue versus iodine, you can start removing certain signals, and then you can start playing with things like overlaying what is iodine over top of the signal. So the beautiful thing about dual energy is being able to distinguish and quantify kind of the distinctness of two different tissue types. All right, how to maximize accurate quantification. You need robust QC programs. You need a phantom that will be able to measure different concentrations of, say, iodine or calcium so that you can review that. There are a variety of different phantoms out there that you can purchase. The Phantom Lab has a bunch of different sensitometry inserts. You can buy the Gamex one that has all these different ones. And these are actually removable, so you can mix and match them, move them all around. And then CIRS has the same thing, mix and match and move it. And so now you can acquire this in dual energy. You can actually place ROIs on that. You can get your quantifications, and you can track and make sure it's consistent over time, or it's accurate because you know which is which, etc. So how does this, of course, affect dose? So most of the time when we're optimizing dual energy CT protocols, attention needs to be paid to that lower KV setting. Low KV setting, this is where noise is most prominent, artifacts are most likely to be induced, and quantification accuracy is most limited. So the advantages, we kind of talked a little bit about this, is you can actually tube current modulate. You can set the right MA for 80 kV tube and the 140 kV. So you actually get really good dose optimization, and you get really good noise properties for both of those. The limitation, as I mentioned, of course, the smaller tube size and the scattering effects. The advantages over here about the fast switching is noise and dose are optimized by patient body habitus. Remember, we set the noise index for the single energy, say 120 kV, and then the system will then select the right MA as it spins it around. And then the limitations, this is actually a little bit older. The newer GE and Canon systems coming out, they use that AI, as I mentioned, so they can fill in the sparse image data acquisition, and so they can fill in all the missing data. So they've actually introduced tube current modulation into fast switching. So it's really kind of a neat approach. That said, I haven't really personally played with it, so I can't speak to it more than that, other than the fact that historically those scanners, the fast switching scanners, were kind of a higher dose level, higher CTDI value compared to the dual tube or the dual layer systems. That is largely going away. The slow switching, the spin. Advantages for that are, as I said, you can do all your tube current modulations. You can set the right kV each one. And the same thing with the split beam. You can do tube current modulation. So as I mentioned, historically, radiation doses for dual energy were always greater than the single energy CT acquisitions. So the only reason we would do dual energy historically is because there was a benefit to get the enhanced contrast and noise ratio. There was a benefit for seeing the material specification, all of that, which came with the penalty of higher dose. Now, with the advances in dual energy CT, the doses are generally equal to or lower than single energy. So I'm going to just give you a bunch of publications if you ever wanted to read them. But basically, if you look at them, I'll just focus you here because of time. This was a second generation dual energy compared to a single energy. You can see the single energy was about 8.8 CTDI and the dual energy is 9.7. Skip down to a third generation dual source CT scanner. The single energy is 6.2, the dual energy is 5.3. So they actually were able to come up with a dose reduction using dual energy CT on the dual source CT scanners. And here, this is now rapid KV. What you can see here is, once again, the CTDI numbers were a little higher, especially historically. But now they're starting to come down a little bit, and they're starting to see dose reductions from dual energy versus single energy. And then here, so this is the second generation, and these are dual energy CT. I can't remember which type of scanner this is. I'm sorry, I'll have to go back and look at that. But the point here is there was higher dose in the dual energy, but then it was a dual source because it says it right here. So this is, once again, a different publication. Second generation dual source, so a Siemens unit versus a third generation. Single energy was lower. Now they're basically the same. They've both gone down, but dual energy CT with a CTDI of 1.3 is phenomenal. All right, for time, I gave you some more quote data, but publications where I compared doses. I'll just skip over that for lack of time. So the thing I want to talk a little bit about right at the very end, I have just a few more slides, is photon counting. So photon counting is different than dual energy because it's a completely different detector base. So our normal energy integrating CT scanners, which we have today, the X-ray comes in, it interacts with some kind of scintillating material, the X-ray turns into light, the light is collected onto the electronics, and then we get the signal out. So every scintillating event that occurs in that detector at a certain moment in time, it could be one, it could be two, it could be three or five, it could be one event, that's collected and read out as one signal. The difference now with these photon counting systems is we're not using scintillating material anymore, we're using semiconductors. So we put a bias across this, a high positive and a negative, and a bias across this voltage. So there's electric field going up and down here. And now when an X-ray comes in and interacts with this material, it's actually going to ionize the material. An electron will be liberated from the material, and the electron, because it feels that current, because there's a high positive on one side and a high negative on the other side, the electron's going to obviously migrate towards the positive end of the detector. And so you get an event, and the electron goes down, it gets detected, and you get signal out. The beautiful thing is these systems are very fast. And so if you get one event in, it'll process it, and another event in, it'll process it, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're actually able to count, hence the term photon counting CT scanners. And where in the past we could get two spectrum with two KVs, you would get two of them, hopefully they'd be separated, and you can get two sets of data out. Or you could actually do two layered detectors, but you've still got two spectrum out. Now, because we can count every photon that hits the detector, now what happens is we can look at the interaction. It comes in, it interacts, we get the signal out, and that signal will have a specific energy. It'll have a specific kind of height, if you want to look at it as a pulse height detector. And we can set bins, and we will say if anything has a signal between here and here, that will be collected as a threshold 1, and anything between here and here is threshold 2, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so now, instead of simply breaking up the spectrum, these Bremsstrahlung spectrums into 2 data streams, now we can break them up into as many data streams as we want, because we're photon counting every one of them. And it's all based on thresholding, setting these energy thresholds. And we can actually do a great job of removing noise, because we can set this lower threshold a little bit higher. So anything that interacts that maybe is a little lower than we really want to include in our signal, we just reject it and throw it away. So what does photon counting give us? Well, let's look at a noise power spectrum. So we take a phantom, a water phantom, or your ACR phantom, we sample it. This paper, this group did it, and they calculated the noise power spectrum for filter back projection, iterative reconstruction, 1 and 3, so they have 2 different settings, but these were all photon counting systems. Do you see how the peaks, just the curves, all align almost perfectly? Which is to say that yes, the magnitude reduces, so there's less noise when they use these iterative reconstruction techniques in conjunction with photon counting. The fact of the matter is the noise texture is largely going to stay unchanged. Photon counting, because now the photon comes in, the X-ray comes in, it doesn't spread because of light. It actually comes in, gets collected immediately. So there's that good spatial correlation of where the X-ray detector, the X-ray interacts with the detector. You can get really good spatial resolution. So here is an energy integrated, so a single energy traditional detector. We're kind of lucky if we can generally get about 7 line pairs per millimeter. Once again, this is an ACR phantom, something that you guys have. Now with your photon counting, you use that same phantom and image it, man, you can go all the way up to maybe 12 line pairs per millimeter. You might even need to go buy a different phantom that can measure out farther than that. In fact, if you do a simple calculation doing MTF, which we talked about yesterday, traditional single energies, they would drop off around the 10 or so, maybe 15 line pairs per centimeter. Now with photon counting, man, you have so much resolution. You basically have equal contrast and double the contrast, equal contrast for double the resolution. And that's why you can see all the way down here, whereas these are all just kind of averaged together. Great spatial resolution. You get all the same VMIs, you get all the same tissue discrimination and be able to distinguish for like iodine concentration. You can do VNC, you can do everything you could do with dual energy, you can do with photon counting. But because you have a better ability to distinguish between tissues now, you can actually start to go from maybe what we would call anatomical imaging, so just looking at something and visualizing it, to functional imaging. And there was a paper that they came out and they looked at perfusion in the lungs based on photon counting. So this is not like a nuclear medicine study or like an MRI study. This is CT. And a CT now can give us some type of functional imaging. I mean, it's a provocative statement, but maybe CT could be somewhat similar to MR in the fact that we have all different tissue types, all different contrast types, just like MRI can provide. And now we can maybe do some kind of functional imaging. So who knows if that's exactly what will happen, but dual energy has a lot of potential to give us more information instead of just looking at the image like we do today. We get an image, we look at it, our radiologists have to read between the lines, look at patient history to try to correlate function with anatomy. And now with dual energy, we can probably do both with the image. So some of the benefits of multi-energy CT: better differentiation and material separation, I already said that. Improved beam hardening, of course. Better visualization of tissue contrast. Most advanced dual energy CT scanners are largely dose neutral. Some of them might even be lower dose than single energy CT. That just depends on the protocols you set up and how you do it. Obviously, older models will be higher dose than the dual energy system. So just FYI. And the large improvement of contrast and noise ratio using VMIs allows potentially reduced dose iodine concentration, injected iodine doses. And yeah, modern dual energy CT protocols can be highly optimized for best patient dose. Just because, we started off talking about DRLs, I should just put one comment out there. There are no such thing as DRLs in dual energy CT, but that doesn't mean there can't be. So we really do need to kind of move that direction. So as you guys have dual energy CT, you should start acquiring that data, start collecting it, start working towards that 2,000 to 5,000 quantity so that you can actually maybe get a DRL for here in Thailand. All right, with that, I'm sorry, I went 10 minutes over.
Thank you so much for the excellent talk. Hey, I thought that for the DRL on the dual energy, can we have the dose on the dual energy in the same group of the CT that we have if you use the same protocol? I mean, like the same mapping name, like a CT head. Without endorsing?
You would need different ones. You'd need to distinguish them from your current. So if you have a CT, so you have a brain non-contrast, brain contrast, that would eventually have to be brain non-contrast single energy, and then you'd have a brain non-contrast dual energy, something like that. But they do have to have different mappings so that the doses, because a dual energy CT potentially could be a higher dose, even if you didn't.
It's going to change like the level for the country, right? That's why you said we should have like a different category for the dual energy.
You need different categories for dual energy.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Any questions here from the audience? Yes.
Professor, we have the question from the beginning when we try to define the type of image, monoenergetic imaging and monochromatic imaging. What is the difference?
So the biggest difference is, here, let me pop out here. Whoa, that was the wrong button. Where are my VMIs? There they are. So when you acquire a single energy CT scan, as you called it, a polychromatic image, you will get one image. Now if you acquire it with multiple, let's say you do dual energy, so we acquire one at 80 and one at 140, now you can do mathematics, and so you have two scans, and you can then, because of the mathematics, you can then cut it, you can reconstruct the image any way you want. I didn't show the math in here. The paper actually that I cited at the beginning will go into that. And so you can actually calculate the equivalency as if this image right here was acquired using a monoenergetic 40 keV signal. And so I was showing you the spectrum. I don't know where is one. A Bremstrom spectrum right here, for example. They're obviously polychromatic. There's multiple energies in here. If you could somehow condense all of that into one single vertical line, an image with a monoenergetic at 40 keV, or any one of those energies, that's the type of energy you would see in those virtual monoenergetics. And so really what it's doing is because of the way it reconstructs it, it can manipulate the contrast and the noise and all that in the image to be associated with a specific energy along the Bremstrom curve. Basically, it's just pure math to get those different looks. The biggest trial that you'll be faced with as a technologist and a physicist is in our current setup, what you have to do is you have to set a protocol up to acquire your dual energy, and you have to know which one of these VMIs you send to PACS. So you might only send, for example, a 70 keV, a 50 keV, or you might send a 50/70 and say like 120 keV. And so you have to kind of know which ones in advance will be processed on the CT scanner and sent off. So that's unfortunate because that leaves behind all the rest of the data that's there. You're actually just cherry picking what you want. There is one vendor out there, they have a tool on their PAC system, that's the Philips, where because it's acquired at 120 kV, they can acquire the image and they can be looking at it in 120 kV. And then if they really want to know what's dual energy, I think it's called Spyglass, because you guys, Magic Glass, yeah, it's Magic Glass. You can just hover over it and it would show you the dual energy. And you can also then quickly go left to right and look at the various different contrast levels as if it was dual energy. So that's one of the benefits of the Philips system. So they don't have to a priori pick which images that the radiologist will look at. they will be able to look at any one of these KEVs based on their need. If they want to see they want to see really good contrast, good iodine conspicuity versus low contrast, just no contrast but no noise. So you have to pick which one. And I'll just end by saying the 120 kV image is most like a 70 keV monoenergetic VMI. And so that's usually the standard. That almost always goes. And then something else will go with it, low or high, or both.
Okay.
It's just a matter of terminology. She's kind of confused of the terminology between like monochromatic and monoenergetic.
I don't think I've ever heard of monochromatic. Have you, Kalpana? Monoenergetic refers to any one of those images. Polychromatic represents KV imaging. So it's the Bremstrong. It's poly as in all energies.
I just Googled it real quick. Monoenergetic and monochromatic is the same thing.
That's what I
Okay.
think because
Same thing.
it's in the textbook.
Oh, it's
When
in the
I
textbook.
taught, it's like the same.
It's the same.
Monochromatic.
We in America use monoenergetic. Maybe some
Maybe
monochromatic means the
European-
same thing, right? Different energies. That's all it means.
One color, one
Yeah.
chromatic. Okay. Hey, I learned something. Thank you. You taught me something.
It's the same thing. Yeah. As an end user,
Mhm.
for me, I don't like the image quality for the virtual non-contrast. How can we improve the image quality? It's like a grainy, blurry, or something.
If you don't like it, you have to do a non-contrast image.
So I have no option, right, to like improve the image quality
It's
for
just-
the.
Yeah, it's because the fact is you can't perfectly remove contrast out of the image. So there's a little residual there. And you also, as Usman, as Dr. Mahmoud, sorry, Usman, Dr. Mahmoud, as he demonstrated in his paper, you actually also remove a little bit of like fat, and the image is not perfect. It's meant to be just a quick look. Hopefully, gross anatomy-wise, you can see what you want to see. But if you want a true non-contrast image, at least with dual energy, you have to actually have a two-phase scan.
What seems like for the like gray white differentiation and maybe other details. So for like a virtual non-contrast, seem like for the gray white differentiation and other details, I cannot see it very. It's like a maybe blurry or grainy
The
or
fat.
something.
You're
Yeah.
losing fat. Yep.
So no choice.
If you want it to look better,
Okay.
if you want it to look better, you actually have to do it
Okay.
two-phase.
Sure. Any question from the online audience? Okay, so seems like we don't have any more questions. So we're gonna get like a 15-minute break. Come back at maybe 11:10 for the last lecture from Dr. Kalpana Kanel. Yep. Okay, so come back at 11:10. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to the last talk for this mission. So the last talk, we are going to talk about the future of the DIR. Any possibility for another modality, or what else can we do by Dr. Kalpana Kanal? So welcome, Kalpana.
Thank you. All right, everyone. Just me keeping you between me and lunch, I guess, right? So I'm going to talk about the future of the dose index registry, but I'm going to talk about it from the perspective of the American College of Radiology dose index registry. But I think this will be helpful for what you can do here in this country as well, besides CT. So because I don't work for the American College of Radiology, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is based on presentations from people who actually are involved right now with the ACR Dose Index Registry. So I want to acknowledge my colleagues, Dr. Jones, Dustin Gress, and Mike Simonovich from the American College of Radiology. They are very deeply involved right now in the DIR. So just to remind everybody again, what is the idea of a registry? It's really to have continuous and cyclical quality improvement processes where you send data, you look at your report that you get, you're comparing to benchmarks. If you're below benchmarks, if you're higher than the benchmarks, you make changes in your process. Again, you submit data. It's kind of a cyclical process, but the idea is that you do it continuously, and over time, you are making sure your data is agreeing with benchmarks. So that's really the point of a registry. It's a guiding principle. And again, to remind you, the American College of Radiology has a National Radiology Data Registry, which applies not only to CT through the DIR, but it's got CT colonography registry, lung cancer screening registry, and so on. If you're interested, you can just go to the website and play around, read about each of these if you're interested. And as I mentioned in my first talk, international countries can participate in the American College of Radiology, at least in the CT dose index registry that I'm aware of. Again, to remind you, how does the dose index registry work? From the scanner, you're sending a DICOM structured dose report to a server, the Triad server. Can you see my, you can see my mouse here. And then the server anonymizes your data. It strips it of all the patient information. That data goes to the dose index registry database, and then you get reports. You can get PDF reports, or you can interact directly with your data on their server and produce whatever reports you want, just like you do in Radiometrics. So let me talk a little bit about how ACR is using the dose index registry data. So Sam did a great job about talking about appropriateness criteria. So in the United States, we have, I would say every 2 or 3 years, the appropriateness criteria is reevaluated and revisited. And basically the idea of appropriateness criteria is using clinical indication to make a decision of what imaging you want to do, whether it's radiography, CT, or other modalities. And so what this example is showing you that potentially you could use the data from the registry, look at the dose, and advise on appropriateness in terms of dose, and maybe include that information in appropriateness criteria moving forward. So it's basically expanding the use of the data beyond benchmarking and maybe using it to collaborate or connect or team up with or partner up with, if you will, with appropriateness criteria. You can also use the data from the DIR to look at radiation exposure to patients in the United States. So DIR is now looking at trying to expand what they do. So what is their rationale and goals for doing that? Well, they want to provide information and knowledge of other modalities besides CT. CT is the most popular one. But why is that important? Because you can look at insight into dose trends. You can look at the practice impact of new technological advances. Sam mentioned, dual energy, photon counting. What impact does that have on radiation dose? So you need to revisit modalities and what you're doing in registries over a period of time as new technology is introduced. Optimization, troubleshooting, and practice characterization, again, is something you want to do and that's what the DIR provides you, that information. You can compare the performance and peers across a number of variables, practice setting and type, and geographic location. So, as I mentioned when I gave the talk yesterday or day before, if I am looking at my trauma hospital, I can look at the dose and compare it to a trauma site somewhere else in the United States. If I'm in a city, in a big city like Bangkok, and I want to compare it to another big city, I can, see what the dose trends are. If I'm in a rural area, if I'm in a community hospital. So it really gives you the ability to dissect the information according to the facility and the geographic location you are at. So what is the future of the dose index registry CT module from ACR? So one thing they're going to do, I showed this diagram earlier, which is the triad server, which you install at your facility and which is where all the data goes to before it's sent to the ACR. So ACR now is considering replacing the server. It's been in use for the last 12 years, and now they are going to remove it. And actually, I think our site is they're using our site as a pilot site to transition to something called DIR Link, which will give you better data transmission interface beginning in 2023, and it'll retire the use of this server. So not only from the point of view of what you're doing with the dose information, but the point of view of hardware that they're using to enhance transmission, data, sending data. And as we saw yesterday, Radometrics, how slow it was, right? So even from a hardware perspective, upgrading their server will help what you're trying to do with data using the DIR data. And the idea of doing this is because it'll be a part of a larger American College of Radiology initiative to introduce the next generation of triad, and that'll be called ACR Connect, which will be a server-based platform that will support interfaces to not only the registry, but the accreditation as well as clinical research initiatives. So right now, Triad only supports dose index registry, and what they're trying to do is move away from that and have a server called ACR Connect, where when I log in, I can not only look at my dose index registry information, I can look at my ACR accreditation information, and I can look at anything to do with clinical research initiatives. So they're trying to kind of broaden your server to include everything that you do with the ACR, which is fantastic, because right now I have to log in separately for my accreditation information. I have to log in separately for my registry information. So I believe that this is an attempt to kind of unify and look at everything all in one place. The other thing I mentioned initially when I introduced the DIR, that the CT dose index registry would accept data not only from the DICOM structured dose report, but also from your old systems that just had a screenshot of the dose. Well, that's going to go away. Moving forward, they're only going to accept the DICOM structured dose report. There are, I'm sure, very few CT scanners, at least in the United States, that do not have DICOM structured dose report. So I think they're going to move away from that and just use that. The adult DRL paper that I talked about a couple of days ago, we published that in 2017. Well, it's 2022, almost 2023. It's time to look at the data again and come up with new DRLs based on any changes in technology, practice patterns. So that's the next thing they're going to look at. And I don't know, maybe if they start looking at it next year, maybe we'll have a new DRL paper by the end of next year. The other thing is pregnancy status. I'm not exactly sure what they're going to do with that. I think the idea is they want to point out that the DICOM header has a DICOM tag there, which you can kind of put values whether the patient is pregnant or not. So if patient is not pregnant, that would be a tag would say 1, possibly pregnant 2, definitely pregnant 3, unknown would be 4. And I don't know how they would use this data. Maybe they would use this data to see that are you scanning pregnant patients at a lower dose and come up with some kind of DRLs, but I'm not sure. But they did mention that as part of, looking at it a little bit more closely in the future. So stay tuned for that. So that's all in CT. Not a lot of changes, just a few. Moving on to other modalities, because here I think in Thailand you're just doing CT, right? Are you looking at other modalities right now?
Yeah, we are also looking at the fluoroscopy guided procedures, but we
Okay.
wait for the ACR to start. So that-
Perfect. So it has started. I'm happy to report. Okay, so let's shift modalities from CT to fluoroscopy. And the American College of Radiology, let's talk about their fluoroscopy module. They started a fluoro dose index registry. It's a latest addition to the DIR. And it's the first modality to join CT in the dose index registry. So CT was 2011, and now we are in 2022. They are introducing the fluoro dose index registry. So the pilot phase of this interventional fluoro dose index registry involved data collection for all interventional radiology procedures from March 1, 2018 through December 31, 2019, just before COVID hit. And I think that everything has been delayed because of COVID. Manual collection of data regarding the fluoroscope configuration and use, as well as the accuracy and stability of the reported dose indices. You know, CT in a way is a lot easier, right? We have CTDI, we have DLP, and you have two phantoms. It's not that easy in interventional radiology because every fluoroscopy system might have a different set of units, right? You might have air karma or DAP, or you might have micro, gray, centimeter, square. It's just very, very complex. Also, the way they name procedures and what they actually do in interventional radiology might differ significantly. So this was a lot, I think, more work to try and do data mapping and things like that. And that's why it's taken so long for it to come online. So that was open for participation. Interactive reports are now available for interventional radiology procedures. And the greatest thing is for sites like mine and SAM, we are already participating in the dose index registry CT. All we have to do is register for the fluoroscopy module and not have to pay extra money. So that's really great. Once you're already involved in the DIR, adding different modalities is no extra cost. And also what the fluoroscopy module allows you to do, it allows you to track cases exceeding the substantial radiation dose level. So when I talked about the other day, what we do with our dose monitoring system, anything over 5 gray is what we monitor, and we have a follow-up on the patient. So you can also do that using the dose index registry portal. So what they did is they collected data from 50 different types of fluoroscope machines at 9 pilot sites. We were one of the pilot sites, University of Washington, for 2 years, and they just completed the data analysis, and reports are now being basically finalized. This information might be slightly old, what I'm presenting, but it still gives you an idea that they have done a lot of work, and they have analyzed more than 50,000 DICOM structure dose report information for interventional fluoroscopy systems. The pilot team put together a fantastic participation guide, and this, I think even Sam showed it in one of his slides. They have basically said, put a paper together saying, how do you as a medical physicist get started with getting involved in the American College of Radiology fluoroscopy dose index registry? But again, the guidance in this document basically can be used for participating in any registry. So it talks about how do you register your site, what mapping you have to do, and any other information to help you get involved and successfully. And this was actually published early last year. So just to give you an example here shows you what this data looks like in the dose index registry for fluoroscopy. This is the device profile. So this is your facility, the station name, Siemens manufacturer. Its a model is Axiom Artis. Are you still using this machine? What year was it manufactured? And then you can also put in other information like location of dose reference point. Typically that's 15 centimeters from the ISO center. You can put that. If that's different for your machine, you can put that. And then single point dose index correction factor, I believe that has to do with your measurement accuracy versus your displayed. So if the displayed air karma differs from your measured air karma by, say, 10%, you can put that correction factor here so that When you look at your doses, that's taken into account. Similar to when you do CTDI, right? What's measured versus displayed. Typically in America, the rule is it should be within 20%. Similar concept. Here you do that measurement, and whatever that factor is, you want to take it into account. And then you can also define, based on your facility, what's your trigger level for substantial radiation dose level. So as I said, for us, it's 5,000 milligray. So for some people, it might be 3,000. For some, it might be 2,000. So you can add that information for your particular fluoroscopy unit and save it. And then I believe what it will do based on what you put in, it will give you an alert that of your 10 procedures today, maybe 5 or over that substantial radiation dose level. So that's, once you put that information, it tells you date of exam, which scanner, what your procedure name was, and it's telling you here that your air karma for these 4 cases was greater than 5 gray or 5,000 milligray. So this is an example, I guess, showing your all alerts where you picked an SRDL of 5,000. But if you did 3,000, these numbers would all be over 3,000. And then you have follow-up status as well. Is it active? Well, this was probably an older case. This is a newer case. Maybe you're still following up, things like that. So things that I showed you the other day where we do the report and we keep track everything by ourselves, now there's a potential that the dose index registry, if you're participating, can keep track of all your events that are greater than 5 gray with follow-up and things like that, which I think is a kind of a side effect or a side advantage of participating in the fluoro dose index registry. You can also do monitoring like we do for follow-up, and we depend on our radiologist to get back to us saying they did a follow-up and whether there was a skin reaction or not. Now you can do the same thing in the dose index registry. This is a fluoro skin reaction assessment where you can put the information of the study, the fluoro time, the air karma rate, and then exactly what I showed you 2 days ago, what we do via email. It's saying, did you perform follow-up? Yes or no? And then, do you see any skin reaction time? And I don't have what the options are here, but you might be probably yes or no. And then when was the follow-up, whether it was, probably within a certain time period, and when you did the follow-up, and any observations seen, most severe reaction date, most severe skin reaction, things like that. Basically, what they're trying to do is have everything about that case, all the information, including follow-up, in the registry so that you can do some kind of tracking of your fluoroskin reaction. I think this is fantastic. So they've gone beyond just reporting the dose. They're actually looking at other tissue reactions that you can track in the registry. The way the DIR, remember when we talked about CT, we were using Radlex. Both Sam and I talked about that. But for fluoro, they're trying to move away from Radlex and they're using Commons, which I think is similar to Radlex. It's a partnership between ACR, I think, and Radlex. And you map using ACR Commons. And I don't have a screenshot showing you what that looks like because I probably have to make an account. But what this over here, this table is showing you, or this figure is showing you, is all the different names for a particular interventional fluoroscopy procedure. This is a nephrostomy placement procedure. And depending on which clinic you're looking at, so here's Cleveland Clinic, here are the different names. Here's Duke, here's Emory, here is my University of Washington, both are hospitals, and you can see what we name them. So what the point of this figure is, it's showing you that the same procedure is called different things at different sites. So similar to CT, where we want to map to make sure we're comparing apples to apples, for fluoroscopy, you also need to map your procedure names. And the way ACR is doing it is using the ACR Common. So mapping is the secret sauce, as we have learned last few days. And everything I just said basically is that mapping poses some unique challenges, and they're going to use reorganization of procedure names in ACR Common. Now, I have not played with this, so I can't tell you more about it. One of my colleagues on my team actually is involved in participating from our hospital, so he knows more of the details. But basically, you're pretty much following the same process that you did with CT dose index registry, where you have to map and make sure you're comparing apples to apples. I just think interventional fluoroscopy is a lot more challenging than CT, because you might start your procedure with one name, but as you're doing your procedure, you might add on different procedures. However, what's coming down the line, which is very, very, very exciting news for anyone participating in the registry, is using machine learning to assist with mapping. So all of us who have participated, even here in Thailand, you're doing mapping manually. All of us are sitting at a computer, looking up RADLEX and mapping. Well, we have machine learning now. We can teach the computer to do that automatically, and then just kind of maybe look at it real quick to look at it and see if everything is good. So ACR is going to adopt machine learning, application of machine learning to assist with mapping, and this is a total game changer, because it will take away all the challenges of doing things manually, and especially for sites like me, where I had a lot of nulls when I presented it 2 days ago. Machine learning will automatically map my procedure names and make life a lot easier. So that's coming down the line. So near-term plans for DIR fluoro, they are going to, just like CT, interventional radiology benchmarking reports will be produced. So it'll be nice to see that for a particular interventional fluoroscopy procedure at University of Washington, this is my error karma rate typically, and then comparing it to, say, SAM. Well, I don't know if SAM's institution, they're mainly pediatric, but I would compare it to an adult hospital and see whether, my error karma rate seems similar to theirs. I think this is going to be very interesting, because this is so dependent on radiologist skill, what type of machines you have, and dose reduction bells and whistles. This is going to really be interesting to see. There's very little information in the literature on benchmarking. There is some, but it's not very modern fluoroscopy. So I think this will really help us all moving forward. So this is for interventional. DIR is also looking at diagnostic fluoroscopy, things like you do in an RF room, for GI, GU cases. And then, of course, having calculation of peak skin dose. All of us do it as physicists, but we all use different conversion factors to go from air karma to skin dose. I'm sure what Sam uses versus what I might be slightly different, what your backscatter factor you used or attenuation factors. So I think the registry is going to make an attempt to also calculate peak skin dose, and they will probably publish what factors they're using. So that also kind of will be very helpful to make sure that we are comparing apples to apples across the country. So this is all very exciting coming down the line for DIR fluoro. Switching modalities, what's happening in digital radiology world with ACR? Well, it's again currently in pilot phase. So right now, I think fluoro is ready. I don't know if they're looking at asking sites to register, but I think if they are not, that's going to happen pretty soon. Digital radiology is very, very much in infancy right now. It's still in pilot phase. And the pilot goals are to collect dose information across facilities using some standard like we did for CT, with CTDI wall and DLP. They want to also develop feedback reports just like CT and determine feasibility to collect technique factors. I kind of feel that, and this probably I don't know if only applies to physicists or does it apply to radiologists and technologists, but I feel that we are so involved in CT and interventional radiology because they are high dose modalities that we forget X-rays because they are very low in dose. But it would still be nice to optimize our X-rays because really in a radiology department, that's bread and butter, right? We do a lot more X-rays than we do CTs or interventional fluoroscopy or interventional radiology procedures. So I think this is a good reminder that, hey, yeah, even focus on the low dose modalities. So they're doing that, and I'm really looking forward to this. So the long-term goals is similar to the other modalities, establish national benchmark, practice patterns, and for radiography, especially since we're all digital, you're looking at target exposure index. You have exposure index and deviation index for digital radiology equipment. So they will try to come up with those for common exams in X-ray. And they are also going to try and develop age-based technique chart for common exams like we did for CT. So again, looking back at the AAPM Task Group 232 report, which came out in 2018, they found that there was a big variable in the exposure index for adults. You can see the large numbers here across the country, and I don't know the details, but this is what they found. So the idea is, and the deviation index also substantially varied from 0. And so what they are trying to see is there is a need to optimize exposure index. And by participating in a registry, coming up with data, you'll kind of see where you are with respect to other facilities and, maybe do some more optimization. I'll be very honest, at our site, my lead technologist, just yesterday sent a report to me looking at EI and DI. She just started incorporating that, which is a good thing, I think. Honestly, we focus more on CT than we do in X-ray. And so we are definitely guilty of that as well. So they're going to try and look at this. However, the problem with X-ray, unlike CT, DICOM structured dose reports are very difficult. We have Shimadzu, and we don't have it's like, it doesn't give us entrance skin dose. I think it gives us DAP, which is really painful. Some systems, you cannot just get it with your system when you're buying equipment. It has to be a separate add-on purchase to have DICOM structured dose report, which I think is ridiculous. It should be part of equipment. Vendors really need to make it part of the equipment. It may be part of a package for QA or upgrade, and access for CT and fluoroscopy is included in the purchase. So you may have to buy it if you don't have it. Or alternatives, you could capture the DICOM header from the image, and I don't know how you would send it to the DIR, but those are some issues that the DIR is working on. Also, the exposure index sensitivity calibration, right? The machines we all have, states do not necessarily require that DR units are calibrated routinely. So when we have a lot of Shimadzu and GE, and you can run their calibration software every day, or whatever the requirement might be, but that's really dictated by the vendor and not by the state regulations. So that's another problem. Everyone, their data they're going to get from across the country is going to have varying EI sensitivity calibration. So they're looking at all of these issues to figure out how they're going to handle it. It is rare, though, that the unit might fall out of calibration. Again, I think the X-ray systems are very well calibrated. They also have doing some kind of mapping now for DR, just like IR and CT. Centers may use different terminology, for doing chest X-ray. I might call it chest X-ray. Sam might call it thoracic X-ray. So again, it has to be some mapping to make sure you're using the same terminology. If you're doing an RF room where you're using radiography and fluoroscopy, there has to be some way of combining the data or sending it to 2 different registries. So those are all the things that they are trying to figure out. There is no ACR common mapping terminology for exams such as clavicles and shoulder, which is what we do a lot in in X-ray. What about laterality? Right and left is a lot things we use in X-ray. Do we need that for looking at dose? So all of these things are still being investigated. That's why it's still in pilot phase. What are the key metrics we want to report? Do we want to report exposure index? And I don't remember what EIT was. Target, yes. EI target and deviation index. So it shows how much time I take in looking at my X-ray reports. And then further granularity, do we want to include the technique, KV, mass, the Kerma area product, things like that. And then they want to produce reports just like anything else for each facility, and then have an executive summary of the common exams. So basically, they're trying to mimic what is very well established and works so well with ACR, which is the CT dose index registry. But again, with every modality, you have to figure out what are the metrics, what machines report those metrics, and how much do you want to collect, and what is really going to a granular level versus what is going to be useful to every facility. So they want to develop some kind of preliminary report by this year, June. I have no idea if they've done it. I think it's been going a little slow. Again, I think COVID has played a little bit of a role in people meeting and talking and having, face-to-face meetings to talk about developing these kind of registries. So hopefully we'll see a DR registry in the near future for the ACR. I also just kind of want to quickly talk about nuclear medicine. They are also looking at building a registry, but it is just right now a committee has been formed. Again, this might be a few months old, what I'm telling you, the information, but there's nowhere near ready for prime time. They're going to build out the ACR Common Lexicon for mapping nuclear medicine exam, and then also figure out how to submit the DICOM structured dose report from nuclear medicine exam. So at some point in the future, we'll also see a nuclear medicine exam registry. So I talked about CT. We have talked about going from CT to fluoroscopy, interventional fluoroscopy. I'm talking about they're working now on radiology and then eventually nuclear medicine. So the idea is let's not just focus on one modality, but let's try and build registries for every ionizing radiation modality so we can keep track of doses, whether the doses are high or low. Excuse me. That's what the registry is thinking in terms of expansion. Now, some tips from the dose index registry or from ACR on how you can get the most of your data. They are advising us to maximize information content of your image metadata. So if you can populate your patient information with patient size, like height and weight in the DICOM header, also info in the CT, DICOM structured dose report of a PET CT scanner, then all of those can be tracked using the registry. Now, I know that we don't put patient information in our DICOM, for our patient information that goes automatically into DICOM header. I don't know if you do that, Sam, but it's something they are advising if we do. And I think the easiest way to do this, if it came from RES, from your radiology information system, when you register a patient, if you collect all that information, then it would automatically go to radiology for the radiology information system, and then moving forward into PACS and into registry. So the key here is, can we do this at the time of registration? Because otherwise it gets difficult. Of course, date of birth is always there, and age is, of course, as well there. But I think some sites may not be putting some of that info. Pregnancy status, I know we don't put it, as far as I know. It would be, again, great to do that. And then, again, model name of your scanner if you really want to compute effective dose and things like that. So they're saying try to put in as much data, because when you put that data in, you can get more information out when you're looking at reports. On obtaining data is a team effort involving risk vendor and modality vendor. As I mentioned, you cannot do some of this unless your risk lets you do it, and then also with your CT vendor, whoever it is. And you can also use exam detail report to explore this information, and it's going to come soon for DIR fluoro. I think when we showed you the CT dose index registry, we clicked on the exam detail, and it gives you a lot of information about the DICOM structured dose report and the actual exam for that patient. And they're going to also have similar information for the fluoro dose index registry. I think Sam did, and I did some show and tell with logging into my DIR and showing you how your information can look at, and actually showed you very coincidentally the null information from my side, because I told you we stopped mapping because for us it was a bottomless pit. And this is exactly what they're saying here. Make sure you're recording the info the way you think so data is accurate. Map things correctly. Note null, which allows you to notice what is not mapped. So there are a bunch of these null exams over here. There are maybe about 300 that have not been mapped. And when I showed you that example, you saw that I had a lot of them because I stopped mapping. It's just a bottomless task for us. So I'm really excited they're going to have AI, because then I can hopefully map all my exams. So make sure garbage in, garbage out. If you do not map everything, you're going to see things like null, which mean nothing to you. You don't know which exam that is. This gives you a really good idea if everything is mapped really well. and you have to periodically check. Mapping is not a one-time thing and you're done. You probably want to keep checking periodically that you don't have any null exams if you have introduced any new protocol names or series descriptors. So in summary, as I said, that I'm like saying I'm giving you these updates as a third person because I don't work or I'm not involved in the dose index registry right now. So some of the stuff I said might be either a little bit few months old information, but it still gives you a good idea of what's coming down the line with the ACR. So they are going to replace the Triad server with something called the Link, which will be fantastic, which will then give us, the clients or the facilities, access to all our information with the ACR, whether it's registry, accreditation, and things like that. It will also give you automatic software updates. You'll have enhanced security protocols and local ID management. So right now, it's really awful. We, for accreditation, we only have one ID, which is for the administrator of your department. And the problem is it's not the administrator who's putting the data in. Physics has to go and upload the dose information. Technologist has to go in and put the clinic data form for the patient. So we have to pick a password that's pretty generic so that we can all log in and put that data. So ACR is going to get rid of that, and then the physicists will have their own login, administrators will have their own login, technologists will have their own login for at least for the accreditation process to make it easier, and that'll put more security. Right now we are all using that one username and one password, which is crazy. They're going to look at future data linking projects. I'm honestly not sure what that means, so I'll leave it at that. Pilot in Q2 2022, phasing out next year. So as I said, we are one of the pilot sites for replacing Triad with Link. I don't know where we are in the process, but I know that my colleague has been working with ACR in downloading the new software and making it work. I'm just going to love this, that we're going to have artificial intelligence for mapping. Great thing, right? Artificial intelligence. We just heard a great talk from Sam on how we are using artificial intelligence for great image quality. But you can use artificial intelligence for pretty much anything in life, not even related to medicine. And this is one thing, right? Helping you map. Again, AI is a great tool, which is going to help all of us in the future. And it's going to only accept, the DICOM structured dose report starting all sites starting 22-23, which is coming up pretty close. So if you have old scanners, it's not going to work, sending your dose information. And the interventional radiology, fluoroscopy, radiology, and nuclear medicine pilots and registries are in process. So it's going to be really exciting to see where the ACR is going to be next year and the year after that, because they have some really amazing works in progress right now. The bottom line, what I'm trying to convey with this talk is that you want to start with CT because that's your high dose, but you do not want to restrict your registry only to CT. You should look at intervention fluoroscopy, radiology, nuclear medicine, and also fluoroscopy, just general RF, GI, GU type fluoroscopy doses. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, co-partner, for give us some vision on the future, on what's going to happen. Any questions, comment from the audience? I believe that Napapong has something to say.
Well, I just would like to thank you both for coming all the way from the US to be with us and guide us on what to do in terms of implementation of the dose index registry. Well, at the moment for the DRLs, we have done most of the modalities as I mentioned, but it's mostly manual. We managed to, like in interventional radiology, we managed to have the national standardized protocol that we collect the data. So if we transform the IR to the dose index registry, probably we will wait for the ACR to see what you guys do first, so that we can have comparison outside the country. So I think we are coming along the way in a good direction, and I think next step is that we need to kind of promote what are we doing and encourage the hospital to participate in this project and make sure that what benefit, what kind of benefit they get on this, because we don't have the accreditation to start with. So our challenge is a bit different from what you do in the US, but I think it's a good step that we already established the DIR as a first phase, and the next phase will come along. I think probably by the end of the year we will have the expansion phase start to roll in, and we will promote to get more sites to participate next year and see how it goes. But for the next one, since the interventional radiology, we have two professional society. One is neurointervention and the other one is the body intervention. We've been working with them closely through the Royal College of Radiologists, so that they are very committed people. They have a lot of good young radiologists who really interested in working on this project. So I think it won't be too difficult to do the IR, because not many centers here. I think it's less than 100 centers, probably like 50.
We also need to include the cardiac catheter, right? Like
Well,
for
they
the
are outside
cardiologist.
radiology, but
Mhm.
but we normally we have to, but see how can we engage them. But for GIGU, we technically we don't really do that many anymore, because like the contrast media, the barium sulfate, not in the market anymore, and the doctors they switch to the scope instead of doing X-rays. So see how it goes.
I have a question. So on the DIR for the fluoroscopy, you mentioned that you have the 9 pilot site to start with, right? So if you have like all info, I believe that the number that you have, the study number, is more than enough for the statistic. But with the 9 pilot site, can you consider that thing as the national DIR for the fluoroscopy?
No, I think what they were doing with the 9 pilot sites was trying to see, let's collect data and figure out all the logistics of setting up the registry. So that's what the 9 pilot sites were. Do you want to volunteer to send us your data so we can play with the logistics, see how things look, how much difference is in naming procedures? So it's like when you start something new, right? You just want to see, if I get people sending from more than one, what are the issues I might encounter? What are the different names of procedures? So that's what that 9 was. It was people who volunteered to participate in the pilot. Yeah.
But the data that you get from that pilot site, when you do the analysis and those things, do you consider that thing at no?
No.
Okay.
Now they use that to figure out all the bugs, the logistics, come up with the process. This is what we're going to do. Now they are opening the registry to everybody, whoever wants to participate. So now once they have, like, say, 200 sites or whatever from the country participating, then that after 3-4 years, just like for CT, we waited 5 years, they will evaluate that data and that will become the DRLs for interventional fluoroscopy.
Okay.
What they just took from the pilot sites will not.
Just like for the logistic to see any issue that
Exactly.
happened.
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay. Sure. Thank you. I think we have one more questions from the online. So regarding the technologists doing the CT protocoling, do they have legal coverage for error in scan protocoling? Do they also protocol for contrast medium injection? I'm not sure who's gonna answer.
Oh, good question. I honestly have no idea. I would think that because they are licensed CT technologists and because they will be covered in terms of legality, yes. And I think right now what they are protocoling, someone is doing oversight.
I think it's
So
under
that error
radiologist.
is caught before they do and scan a patient. So until they're confident that there'll be no errors or minimal error, I think there's oversight right now.
I think it's
But-
always under radiologist, right?
Yes,
Like,
and yeah, and just like you are protected from legal issues as a physician, so are the technologists. I mean, there is malpractice insurance, and I am sure the department takes responsibility for all the professionals that work in the department. So
I
that
think
should
so.
not be a reason for them to hesitate doing what is what we're
protocoling.
trying to do. Yeah, so that the department would be covering them if there's any issues. I would
Okay.
think, Sam, don't you agree?
Okay. Any more questions, comments? Yep.
So as long as that we use the radiometric and for the interventional radiology, we have one option for the peak skin dose calculation. So for us, can we use that number to be the reporting number for the peak skin dose?
So if I understand your question correctly, you're saying you have some factors.
Calculation.
I think in radiometrics, so they use the those as reference point, and they have the mathematical phantom based on the couch location, and then they convert that into the peak skin dose, really at the skin of the patient, depending on like tube angle or whatever.
Right.
So her question is, can she just report the dose from that?
I don't know how the registry will be set up, whether they would just take the peak skin dose information. It's possible that they would. It's also possible the registry would do its own calculations, because the problem is if she reports her peak skin dose and I report it, but her underlying assumptions are different than mine, like backscatter factor and table pad attenuation and all that, then we are not comparing apples to apples. So I suspect that they might have in the registry a set factors that way they will take her air karma value and mine and convert it with that one set of variables. Otherwise, we are going to be sending data that means even though it says peak skin, we both use underlying assumptions that was totally different. So I would think that they would not do that. You could probably send it, but I don't think they would rely on that to give you accurate peak skin calculation.
It's kind of complicated now. Like from my experience, like if we use radiometrics, the correction factors from different fluoroscopic vendors are different.
Absolutely.
And then when I use the dose watch from GE, the GE machine is just correct because it's GE. They know the couch thing, in my opinion. But when we use the dose watch with Philips machine, it's just kind of confused.
Yeah. So what we do is we use dose watch to look at the worst air karma, like which is the worst. So even though the whole procedure may have been 6,000 milligray, if the worst is 3,000, that's what we are looking at. And then we use our own factors to come up with what the skin dose is. Because you don't want that 5,000-6,000 number, because it's, you just want the area which is a peak. And we then use our own numbers. And every year when we test the machine, we do a measurement of width without table, width without pad, look at our difference in our measured versus displayed air karma. All those factors we take into account. So our calculation for peak skin dose is still manual. Even though I'm using dose watch to figure out my peak skin, the worst peak skin air karma, then I calculate the actual skin dose. So it's still a two-step process for us. We're just relying on our dose monitoring system to give us the skin mapping, because they do a better job of that than we can, since we're not in there, observing the case and looking at all the angles. So that's the way we do it.
Before you leave, Dr. Sam, my colleague, asked that because the technology is come to us already for the dual energy QC. Like now, in the world of the medical physics, you have a guideline already for the dual energy CT QC.
So you're going to, the biggest difference between the dual energy CT QC and single energy is being able to characterize what's going on. So you need a phantom that has the different iodine and calcium inserts. I think that's a real good start. Or you guys have CAT fan, right? Okay, yeah. So using that, so I would do all my normal single energy testing. If you have a tube system, if you have Siemens, then you're going to want to do it for both tubes. And then on top of that, I do my my iodine and calcium concentration calculations to make sure they're accurate. And what else do I do for dual energy?
What calculations do you do, Sam?
So like I have a phantom like that. I have a Gamex phantom. And so yeah, the phantom tells me, the insert says, it's 5 milligrams of, iodine per milliliter. And, I have 10 or 15 of them. And so I know when I scan it, which is which, and then I'll do the quantitation on it to see if they're accurate, and they usually are. And then I follow that with time. And so I do that for calcium and iodine, because that's what they have in that phantom. I'm trying to think what else I do. Besides, you have to calculate CTDI if it's 2 tubes for both. For fast KV switching, I'll check my CTDI as a function of KV, but the reality is when it's switching, you can't really do CTDI because it's switching at the same time. Actually, I work with the IEC also. And the IEC is the one that writes the rules for the vendor on how they do their calculations. And so right now there is no official rule to calculate CTDI for dual energy because everyone has their own way. We're working on that. So, but we just sent in a proposal for the IEC, and if it gets accepted, it'll take us 10 years to come up with the standards. So don't hold your breath. It's not going to come fast. But right now, the best thing you could do, the question was, do you just, like on a fast switch or a 2-tube as it spins, do you just calculate CTDI as an aggregate of the two? Generally, what I do is I just look at it as each of the, if I know my CTDI is accurate for all my KV stations, I'm happy with that, personally. So.
One thing, do want to mention that in the United States, there is no requirement to do any dual energy testing right now. So what Sam is doing is he's doing it on his own because it's a technology available on the scanner. But to do that, as he said, he had to buy a phantom, or you probably have to make up some kind of phantom. So it's not a requirement yet, but I think maybe in the future it might be. But I don't do, honestly, any dual energy testing. I don't have a phantom. I'd have to buy one. And, phantoms are very expensive. So I think the only way we can kind of keep track to make sure everything is going well is the dose that you look at, that you monitor, and then information from our radiologist saying that, if they are looking at iodine-only images or calcium-only images, that something is fishy, doesn't look right, or I think that's really unfortunate, but that's really the way we are doing it right now because we would have to buy a phantom. Those are expensive.
Yeah, those phantoms, you can even get like the CIRS phantom can come with different annulus rings, so you can do big different sizes. But ultimately, for QC, I just want to know accuracy over time. So you look at your iodine concentration maps, your water maps, your all of those, and you make your measurements, and you see how the numbers change. So I can't think. I don't think I do anything else.
So here's this is from Gamex. This is what Sam's talking about.
This is the one they have.
Do you have that?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So then you can use.
Yep.
That's great. Yep. It gives you all the information, tells you
Yep.
what to do.
Yep. That's all real good.
And then the other one was SIRS.
They have too much money here.
You do.
Yeah, SIRS is the same thing. They just sell the Gamex one.
So dual energy is becoming, and I didn't really mention this, but dual energy is becoming very popular, especially in the therapy world and proton therapy world. Because if you use the 2 spectrum, you can calculate a more accurate dose stopping. So when they do their dose calculations for the beam on and off for proton and photon, it's just much more accurate. So for example, at our hospital, we use Eclipse for our dose monitoring, and we've been doing single energy for a long time, but we're now buying a dual energy CT scanner just for the CT simulation and therapy. So I don't know how many dual energy scanners they use for your therapy centers, but that's becoming very popular in the US. So my guess is eventually, though, because all of the dose calculating softwares like Eclipse and whatnot are all, they all accept dual energy now.
for the retake reject analysis on the RDSR, the data on that, what do you think for the importance of that kind of the data? Because for the DR or X-ray general X-ray, for the repeat event, I think it make more dose to the patient. So
Okay, so what the question is about repeat data for X-rays?
it should be on the
I think what she mean is like, should we consider to have information like on the diagram metadata or RDSR regarding the reject and retake?
For X-ray?
Yeah.
Yes, so that is actually a very good question. We do monitor our repeat and reject rate for X-rays, and we have software, and I don't remember what the name of the software is, but we do monitor that, and we try to aim for between 5 and or less % for repeat reject software, for repeat reject analysis. 5% or less. And actually I'll try and send you, Tanya, the report, and maybe you can send it.
Yes.
What my technologist sent me yesterday or day before, and what it shows for repeat reject analysis, and maybe just to give her an idea what that looks like. And it's some software that we use to do that, but the technologist runs that analysis for us for X-ray. But I think it's incredibly important because X-ray, the repeat rate can be very high. So you want to keep track of that. I think it's a good question.
I think this is solely by practice, it's the responsibility of the technologist.
Absolutely.
Not the physicist. So physicists will overlook, like they have to report, and then physicists will come in to take a look and then see how things going on.
We worked with our technologists to kind of determine thresholds. Like, I looked at the literature to see what's out there, and there's not much in the literature, but somewhere around 5 to 8%.
Yeah, I think APM ACR is like 8% for adults.
Yeah, 8%. So I don't remember the number she sent me in the analysis day before yesterday. I think she sent me, but I will send you what they do just so that you have an idea what it looks like, and then what is the reason, right? For the most of the reason for repeat or reject is positioning, and so that's an education thing for the technologist. Like, especially when you have students and they didn't know how to position the patient, then you have to reject that image. So that is, I think, the number one reason for repeating exams.
easy to repeat.
What's that?
It is very easy to repeat the study. When you
Absolutely.
Yeah. Any more questions? No. You can ask more questions.
Yes,
Don't care about
please.
Naparapong. He's just hungry. So I would like to thank everyone for joining us today, and we're gonna send you a evaluation link, evaluation form to complete and tell us what our expert did on that job and how we did on the organizing this course. So the link will send by today, and please complete the evaluation form by October 16 midnight. October 16 midnight to get the Thai CME credit, and you will get a total of 34 CME credit after you complete the evaluation.
Oh.
For technologists, the cap is only 10.
Oh, okay, I'm so sorry about what you get.
You can do 100 days, we give you 10.
Oh, okay, yeah. So, but I mean, like for radiologists, you will get 34, but for technologists, it's up to Dr. Naparapong on how much or how many he want to give it to you. Right, and before we end the session, I'm gonna ask Dr. Naparapong to say thank you or like anything that you want to say to the expert, and I will let the expert express or say something to us, and we're gonna call it complete.
Yeah, since it's lunchtime already, I will make it quick. Well, thanks again, you both, for coming all the way, and we hope that in the future we can invite you back again to take a look at our new project. I think we understand a lot about what we are doing, and then we will do things on the right track. And then, of course, we can discuss with you further. And for the audience, not only the Thai, but also colleague from Singapore and from other countries, thanks a lot. I think we can share our what we are doing and what you are doing, and we can learn from each other, I believe. So I know now that in Asia, Japan start already, Thailand start already, and I think Singapore will start. And I think in the future, we will have more and more country to do this. So thanks again for coming.
Well, it was a good time. I enjoyed this week. It was actually really nice seeing your data from the very beginning. And having been a part of this process for several years, it's actually been very rewarding to see how far along the Thai group, the delegates, all of you here, and you virtually, I'm just very impressed with the numbers that you've been able to generate by bringing everything together and collating, curating it. You guys you have followed the letter of the law from the IAEA, the recommendations that we've given in the past. So it's just been a true pleasure to be a part of this process. And so I wish you luck as you continue going on. I know we've talked exclusively about CT this week, but we have talked about the other registries. Dr. Kanal, of course, has talked about the need to not just focus on CT, but also to include all other modalities, and I know you guys will eventually get there. So it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out, and maybe next time we can come back and we'll see, we can talk DR and fluoroscopy. So I'm excited for that.
Thanks, Sam. I want to repeat what Sam said. I agree. It's been a very interesting week. At least Sam's been here before. For me, it was the first IAEA trip. I learned a lot. It's been a great experience. And just like Sam, I'm very impressed with what you're doing here. And I think you can only go higher and better. I also want to take this opportunity to thank our hosts, which is the two of you, for taking such good care of Sam and me. We really appreciate it. You haven't left us alone because maybe you thought we got worried we might get lost in Bangkok. So we appreciate you taking, your free time after we are done with our lectures and guiding us and having dinner with us, and we really do appreciate that. And we look forward to coming back. I think it will be really great to see your trajectory, how you progress from here. And again, thank you so much for inviting me. Thanks to you, Sam, too, for including me in your process because you've been here a few times. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, so I would like to thank everyone for being here with us. Not only the speaker, not only the audience here, but I think it's like a team effort that we complement each other. Technologists, radiologists, and also the medical physicists. This is your show for the medical physicists to do this thing. And I think in Thailand, we need to thank the Ministry of Public Health คุณอนงใช่ไหมคะจากกรมวิทย์นะคะที่ from the she's a person who helped with the national DRL from the government and complement with the data that we got the support from the IAEA. So I think this is a team effort, and I would like to thank everyone for coming, joining, and doing this thing together, and we can make the better step for the nation, and not only for the nation, not only for the Thailand, but also for the Southeast Asian country, that we can be like teach them, guide them, or do something for them, as you did for us from the America, from the ACR, and guide us what we have to do. So thank you so much, everyone, and we will see you guys again next time. Stay tuned on the IAOC meeting, and you can watch the rerun session on the IAOC Facebook and also the YouTube channel. So thank you so much, everyone. See you. Take care ค่ะขอบคุณค่ะ Thank you.